Coming up next, it's a hearing on competition in the cable television industry. The hearing was held this morning by the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Telecommunications and Finance. Members met to discuss H.R. 2546, a bill that would encourage competition by allowing telephone companies to enter the cable television industry. Subcommittee members heard from representatives of the telephone and cable TV industries, as well as Commerce Department officials and representatives of state and local governments.
Good morning. Today, the subcommittee is holding a legislative hearing on H.R. 2546, the Communications Competitiveness and Infrastructure Modernization Act of 1991, introduced by Representatives Rick Boucher and Mike Oxley. The legislation on which we will hear testimony today makes a compelling case for upgrading our nation's telecommunications infrastructure. As it becomes clearer that the essence of the new American and global economies is knowledge and information-based, I feel strongly that it is incumbent upon policymakers to set national goals for the development of a telecommunications network of seamless logic and efficiency. It will be impossible for any nation to conduct a 21st century economy with a 20th century infrastructure. Now, many of our international competitors are well aware of this fact and have begun to upgrade their systems and to accelerate their fiber deployment and infrastructure modernization. Without an efficient and ubiquitous electronic highway system built upon advanced telecommunications technologies, America may very well relegate itself to second-class citizenship in the global village. Setting national goals for an infrastructure which is second to none and which enables all Americans, both rich and poor, urban and rural, to have access to the information age is a critical undertaking. I want to commend the authors of the legislation for contributing to this process. The legislation also recognizes that promotion of increased competition to the cable industry is the best protection ultimately for the American consumer. As this subcommittee considers legislation to broaden competition to the cable industry, we should commit ourselves to the goal of establishing for each and every American household the opportunity to choose from at least 2 providers of multiple channels of video programming. We should embrace competitive principles to encourage new technologies as well as new entrants to competition, while also regulating the cable provider in the interim, that is, until real competition exists. As we move forward, however, we must ensure that new competitors do not kill competition. We must also ensure that consumers don't have to foot the bill for services they don't want or telephone company investments that do little else than gold plate the network. Any legislation must protect residential telephone subscribers from illegal cross-subsidies. Now, while I understand that one glove does not fit every hand, we must look at safeguards for telco entrance into cable provision and enact strong firewalls to prevent illegal cross-subsidies and anti-competitive behavior. And we shouldn't overlook how cable companies might cross-subsidize new telephone offerings like personal communication services from their unregulated cable monopoly. In addition, we must be wary that as we search for competition and encourage the integration of telecommunications services and universal service, we do not forfeit diversity. The myriad of voices that broadcast and cable television has provided to the American consumer must not be sacrificed in our effort to spur the development of a competitive information industry. In the very near future, we will no longer be able to speak in terms of phone companies or computer manufacturers or cable companies. They will all become part of a larger information industry. Businesses will integrate in this mega info industry, and the services and technologies they provide will also become integrated. Indeed, telecommunications in the 90s will embody a robust era of competition in which we will see the growing together of what we continue to think of as diverse technologies and high-tech products. As we continue to explore how America will go on a high-fiber diet, one that is well-balanced to ensure a truly competitive market and that results in consumer benefits for all Americans, I look forward to working with my colleagues, and especially with the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Boucher, and the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Oxley. Today we will begin our hearing with testimony provided by Assistant Secretary Janice Obuchowski of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, along with Deputy Assistant Secretary Thomas Segru from the Honorable Patricia Ticer, Mayor of Alexandria, Virginia, and from Kenneth Gordon, representing the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. On the second panel, we will hear from industry and consumer representatives. That concludes the opening statement of the Chair, and I'll recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking minority member, Mr. Rinaldo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to commend you for calling this hearing, and my colleagues and good friends, Mr. Oxley and Mr. Boucher, for introducing a thoughtful piece of legislation that is the subject of this morning's hearing. In particular, I want to express my willingness to work with them in addressing not just present-day concerns about our telecommunications infrastructure, but in seeking to ensure that telephone companies make the financial commitment in the future so that we remain competitive in the global telecommunications market in the next century. The legislation before us would require telephone companies to submit a broadband communications system implementation plan to the appropriate state regulatory agency and ultimately to the FCC. These agencies would have to certify that the plan meets the mandate of implementing a broadband system by the year 2015 throughout the company's service area. To encourage telephone companies to make the investment, the bill proposes a gradual and partial repeal of the 1984 Cable Act's prohibition against telephone companies providing video programming services. Proponents of repealing the cable telco restriction argue that by encouraging the growth of alternatives to cable, we will create a competitive marketplace environment in which consumers will receive more choice, lower rates, and better service. Opponents counter that argument by saying that telephone companies will be able to compete in an essentially unregulated cable market by cross-subsidizing costs with their regulated telephone revenues, and broadcasters warn that we run the risk through telco entry of simply replacing one monopoly with another. In my estimation, both sides have legitimate arguments, and they underscore the importance of the larger public policy implications in this debate. Technology is not standing still, nor will business or our competitors. We all are aware that Japan has embarked on a multi-billion-dollar commitment to wire the entire nation with fiber optic cable by the beginning of the next century. And we all know how important technological developments have been in the telecommunications field. The fundamental decision is not whether or not Americans should have these services, but how they are provided. It is our obligation as policymakers to evaluate the arguments we are presented, to look at the long-range implications of this legislation, and to make the best decisions we can for the public good. However, that's easier said than done. Some people contend that repeal of the cable telco prohibition would solve the problems in the cable industry. I'm frankly skeptical. I don't think we would see too many municipalities awarding 2 franchises. I don't think in most municipalities 2 franchises would be able to make a profit. But even if it happened, how could we ensure that there would be no inappropriate cross-subsidy by regulated monopolies? At our recent hearing on competition to cable from wireless, KU band, and other technologies, I cautioned that unfettered cable competition would not likely become a reality until Congress determined the terms and conditions under which these other technologies may compete fairly in the delivery of video programming to the home. The same challenge is before us today with respect to telephone companies, and we must address the hard issue of how they should be allowed to compete before legislative relief is considered. We want to ensure that consumers have the greatest choice at the best possible rate. Once again, I want to commend my colleagues, Congressman Oxley and Boucher, for their considerable efforts in examining this issue and initiating the dialogue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Scheuer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it's a very exciting prospect to participate, even in a supporting role, in these breathtakingly important public policy decisions that we're making that is going to determine how we define America in the 21st century. The Japanese, as we have heard, have made a commitment to move into the world of fiber optics cable. They will be, the entire archipelago will be wired into a single fiber optic system. It is reported that between 1/3 and 40% of the GNP of Japan in the next century will be related to the increased productivity and the potential that their fiber optic system will make a reality. We must move in that direction with the same sure-footedness, the same determination, the same commitment that the Japanese are, to link our schools, our businesses, our factories, our hospitals to a fiber optic system. And the question is how. How will we ensure competition? How will we ensure a state-of-the-art infrastructure? And how, at the same time that we're moving toward a system that will be completed in a decade or a decade and a half, we're concerned about the current status today of the ratepayer, of the telephone subscriber. How do we assure fairness and equity to them?
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Ritter.
Mr. Chairman, I think the gentleman from Ohio preceded me here, and I would yield to him first.
Well, we try to recognize members in order of recognition of their seniority as the gavel comes down, and I think the gentleman was here. If the gentleman would like to yield to the gentleman from Ohio.
I would certainly appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, and I happen to be just tailoring up a few loose ends on my opening remarks. Thank you.
The truth comes out.
In addition to my magnanimity.
The gentleman, I always thought that the gentleman's pride and his humility, I felt, was always his best quality. Can I recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Oxley?
I thank the chairman and the distinguished tailor from Pennsylvania. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to express my gratitude for the promptness with which you are holding today's hearing on H.R. 2546, which Mr. Boucher and I introduced just 3 weeks ago. As I stated at last week's hearing on cable competition, the idea, and perhaps I should say ideas, embodied in this legislation are ideas whose time has come. As FCC Chairman Sykes told the subcommittee just last week during our hearing on the common carrier issue, H.R. 2546 is not a bill which seeks to pit one industry against another. Rather, we are attempting to take a serious look at the nation's future and advocate pragmatic, creative, and fair-minded approaches to deal with the challenges that we face. I think it is obvious that allowing telephone companies to compete in the provision of cable television will lead to lower rates and higher quality service. This is the natural byproduct of allowing market forces to work freely. But the Boucher-Oxley bill's aims are much higher than merely improving cable television service. H.R. 2546 has important implications for our nation's educational system, its health care system, and the ability of American business to compete in the world economy. The legislation establishes a clear telecommunications policy which will allow us to build a nationwide broadband infrastructure in a time frame that is at least on par with our major competitors. Without this or similar legislation, we run the risk of, at worst, not developing the sort of infrastructure that will be essential for our economic success in the 21st century, or at best building a fragmented, disjointed, hybrid communications infrastructure which will make some portions of the country information rich while leaving other portions of the nation information impoverished. At various stages in our nation's history, when economic necessity dictated that an infrastructure was required, the federal government became directly involved in the construction of waterways, the building of railroads, the establishment of an interstate highway system, and assured the universality of the electric grid. However, the federal government can no longer bear the sort of massive investment which would be needed to build the information infrastructure we will need to compete in the next century. Instead of advocating a program of massive federal expenditures or a complex series of government grants and tax incentives, H.R. 2546 allows us to modernize our telecommunications infrastructure by allowing the forces of the free market to work. The bill does not call for the subsidization or protection of any industry. Rather, H.R. 2546 mandates lifting the burdensome regulations which have prevented local telephone companies from competing in the profitable cable television market. H.R. 2546 picks no winners and no losers. It simply allows for free and open competition within our nation's telecommunication industry. Now, I am not bashing anyone in our nation's telecommunications industry. I think we have the best telecommunications system in the world. But once we were the world leader in automotive manufacture. Once we were at the forefront of the design and production of computer chips. At one time we were the world leader in the manufacture of televisions, and we invented the VCR. I don't want us to lose our leadership in the telecommunications industry as we may have in these other areas. If we do, the consequences could be severe. As we will hear in the testimony be presented today, the establishment of a broadband two-way public infrastructure would vastly increase our ability to save lives through expanded health care availability. Can we really afford the chance that the person who would have discovered a cure for cancer does not make that discovery because he or she dies at an early age from a disease or injury that would have been treatable had he or she had access to our best hospitals? The type of access that would be possible with a broadband link. Can we run the risk that an individual who would have developed an innovation allowing our nation to compete successfully in the global market never develops because of a poor rural school fails to allow him to keep up with his urban cousins, and therefore he doesn't get into the college that would make him train to do that which would be necessary to make that breakthrough? I think we need to make this technology available to all of our citizens. We can't afford not to. These are just the obvious advantages of establishing a nationwide broadband telecommunications infrastructure. There are numerous other benefits that we don't have time to get into here. For example, think about the environmental benefits we will reap from being able to diversify our industry from our urban areas and allowing the information age to put the entire nation to work. Think of the efficiency that a modern infrastructure will bring to our nation's business. And remember that even if we don't build this sort of infrastructure, Japan, France, and many other nations will. I can't see us maintaining our leadership in the world economy if we deny the American people access to the tools they need to compete. Mr. Chairman, I know you appreciate the value of our telecommunications infrastructure, and I appreciate your holding this hearing, which I believe will allow us to build it. In my estimation, this is inevitable. It is something that the future of this nation is critically dependent upon, and our ability to craft legislation in this area will be most important for our nation's future, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Boucher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I extend my thanks to you for scheduling the hearing this morning on H.R. 2546 and the range of issues that legislation is designed to address. I also want to commend both you and your staff for the excellent cooperation that you have provided to my colleague, Mr. Oxley, and me, both in scheduling the hearing and in obtaining the testimony of the witnesses who are present this morning. And I want to commend my colleague from Ohio, Mr. Oxley, and his staff for the excellent leadership that they have provided in helping to structure the legislation that is the subject of today's hearing. Mr. Chairman, you and some of the others this morning have talked a bit about the need to modernize the national telecommunications infrastructure, and that is certainly one of the foremost goals of the legislation that we're offering. But it has another very valid goal as well, and that is to address some of the problems that exist today in the cable television industry. And I'm going to spend just a few minutes at the outset this morning talking about what those problems are and how we, through passing this legislation, can address them successfully. I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, that the cable television industry today is in something of an unpardonable condition, and that is, it is an unregulated monopoly. And that flies in the face of the American economic experience. It is not a natural monopoly in the sense of an electric utility, for example, where economies of scale require that only one entity serve the locality. It is an artificial monopoly, the artificiality of which was created in part by federal statute, the 1984 cross-ownership restrictions of the Cable Act in particular, that prohibit telephone companies from offering cable TV service in the localities where they also offer telephone service. And its artificiality as a monopoly is ensured by some practical occurrences within the industry itself. One of those is an informal arrangement among cable companies where they simply agree not to compete with each other. Another is the vertically integrated nature of the industry, where the same companies that disseminate cable signals also own the programming that they're disseminating. And that gives the industry a very convenient ability to deny cable-affiliated programming to any potential cable competitor. And so the artificial monopoly is assured through both legal and practical means. Our legislation is designed to address the problems that arise from that state of facts. Now, what briefly are those problems? Well, first of all, cable rates have soared. If you look at the figures, since deregulation of the industry in the middle 1980s, in many localities across the country, cable rates have gone up by more than 100%. I don't know of another product or service in the American economy that has consistently increased in price over that time period as much as cable rates, perhaps not even health care. Another problem that we face is poor service. I have constituents who complain that every time it rains, their cable service goes out, and oftentimes it doesn't come back on until it rains again. It takes days to get the problems addressed. Another very real problem is an absence of programming alternatives. Consumers essentially can take or leave whatever the single company that provides the service offers. There really isn't any significant extension of cable service today beyond the boundaries of towns and cities out into rural America. So if you live in the countryside, your opportunity to get television service is significantly less than your urban counterpart. And as my colleagues have indicated, the current policies and laws really aren't doing very much to encourage the development of a modern fiber optic network that will enhance not only television reception, but also the American economy over the long term. Our legislation is designed to address that range of problems. I think it does so very directly and succinctly. And Mr. Chairman, I join with you in welcoming our witnesses, and we'll look forward to their testimony on that range of issues. Thank you very much, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Ritter.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and I want to commend you for holding these hearings. This is a significant issue for the future of the United States economy in the information age. I want to commend the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Boucher, and I'm sorry, thinking of Mr. Cooper. From Virginia, Mr. Boucher, and the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Oxley, for their leadership in calling attention to this issue, pursuing it energetically, and coming up with some possibilities for actually getting the job done. Many of us agree that we need to improve our nation's telecommunications infrastructure. That's a given. Many of us are saying that the United States of America could achieve new levels of economic growth and prosperity with a broadband, seamless or nearly seamless fiber optic network. And it's critical to this nation's economic future that we're able to have a telecommunications infrastructure that's the best or up there with the very best in the world. Time and again, I and others have compared our telecommunications infrastructure in this information age to the interstate highways of the automobile age, the interstate highways of the future, and really that's where it's all going. I believe that the key players in this issue, Mr. Chairman, have a lot to gain by working together instead of what we've been seeing, which is the healthy and dynamic growth of various parts of the system. But it's necessary to start putting the various parts and components of the system together such that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The subject is too important to America's information age, America's economic future, for a disintegrated approach, if you will. There are many good ideas, Mr. Chairman, that are contained in H.R. 2546, and I believe that if enacted, fiber deployment would be increased and it would be accelerated. However, I do understand some of the politics here. I do understand the fears that one industry might be thought of as dominating another. And I would hope that the affected industries could work together and with us to work out the differences. But reality sometimes knocks your door down. Now, as you know, I have been working on a plan that would perhaps a little more directly work to create this national fiber optic network. And I've tried to make this approach one that is less industry specific or non-industry specific. We essentially have two different schools of thought on how to get to nationwide deployment of fiber to the curb, and both of them have relevance. One says that we give companies, like in this sense here, telephone companies, back-end incentives to deploy fiber. In other words, once the fiber is deployed, companies regain their investment through the provision of additional services that are not currently available to them. The other school of thought, which I would dub the Ritter School, says that the greatest impediment to nationwide deployment of fiber is the current, and I emphasize current, price differential between the cost of fiber and the cost of copper, and that it demands some creative arrangement to get over the initial differential. Right now, it's much less cost efficient to deploy fiber. However, once we reach a fiber to the curb penetration of about 10% nationwide, the cost of using fiber will be equal to or lower than the cost of using the current technology. It simply boils down to the cost benefit of volume production, the wonderful impact of the learning curve and the economies of scale. The more fiber is deployed, the less the cost per mile of that fiber. The more fiber is produced, the more we improve the production process, the more we bring down the cost. And that's where the plan in promoting this kind of a scenario comes in. The plan creates a system of economic incentives, such as capital availability for infrastructure improvement through an infrastructure trust fund to spur the initial deployment of fiber. Mr. Chairman, can I be recognized for additional 2 minutes? 1 minute?
The gentleman is now at 6 minutes. We will give him an additional, without objection, 1 minute for his opening statement.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. You need to spur the initial deployment of fiber. Once the initial deployment occurs, it's downhill. And what I would hope is that this fund could be available to all telecommunications entities for cable, local exchange, inter-exchange, corporate networks, research networks, and the like, and that we could perhaps achieve this initial funding through one way would be competitive bidding for spectrum, and part of this idea of competitive bidding would be to establish a fund to improve our nation's telecommunications future. The Chairman and I have a dialogue going on that. I'm also looking at other ways to fund a network, such as tolls, the possibility of tolls for network usage once the national network's established. And then have the FCC set national standards for interconnectability. In Japan, the NTT can just go right ahead, deploy fiber, the game is over, it's easy, you do it from the top down. Here, we have so many different entities, such variety, such healthy variety. We need to put it together. The sum of the parts has to be greater than the individual ones. This is how we can get to putting this puzzle together, Mr. Chairman, by all of the parties working together. And I thank the Chairman for his indulgence and yield back the rest of my additional minute.
You gentlemen pulled it together quite well. A seamless, fiber-based opening statement. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Bryant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to have to be absent from the bulk of this hearing, unfortunately, because of a conflicting committee obligation. I'd hope to be here for the whole time. I'd just like to leave the panelists with one question that I'd like to hear an answer to, or read the answer to, since I'm not going to be able to hear it in as much as the first 45 minutes has been taken up with you hearing our speeches. And that is a concern raised with me yesterday by independent television stations, that it's going to be difficult for them to compete with the telephone companies in buying programming if the phone companies, with all of their might, are involved in cable television, the cable television industry, and have to go for the programming as well. I think it's an interesting problem that ought to be addressed. Hope someone will answer that.
Okay. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Fields.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for holding this hearing today. As always, you've been true to your word by holding the hearing to examine the issue of whether telephone companies should be allowed to offer cable service. And I'm pleased to be a co-sponsor again this year of legislation that will introduce a measure of market economics into the cable television industry by allowing local telephone companies to provide video services. In the 2 years since I originally co-sponsored telco entry legislation, both the issue and the bill itself have matured significantly. The measure I supported in the last Congress emphasized the essential element of 20th century economics, and that's competition. The chairman of the FCC, this subcommittee, consumer groups, and the Bush administration have all acknowledged the need to instill new competition in the cable TV market. Mr. Chairman, the benefits of competition, I think, are obvious. Competition provides natural downward pressure on consumer rates and upward pressure on consumer service. Competition is the backbone of the American economic system, and it's clear that the cable industry has grown to the stage where it should, and I believe it can, compete with its most natural rival, the local telephone company. The bill that's been introduced this year, sponsored by my colleagues, Mr. Boucher, Mr. Oxley, Mr. Cooper, Mr. Barton, myself, ventures well beyond the core idea of cable competition and reaches into what will be the heart of the 21st century economics, and that's international competitiveness. Under H.R. 2546, we have broadened the emphasis from the microeconomics of restraining cable rates to the more macro issue of assuring America's competitiveness. In this legislation, we've emphasized for the first time the need to build a broadband infrastructure which will sustain the United States competition position in the global telecommunications market. This bill contains several other improvements over the bill my colleagues and I introduced in the last Congress. For instance, the bill establishes a mandated priority on interconnecting schools and hospitals so that the benefits of this broadband technology are brought first to those who need it the most. Also in the legislation, we prohibit the option of telephone companies buying out existing cable companies, thus ensuring that one monopoly is not replaced with another monopoly. In addition, we establish a 25% cap on the number of channels that a telephone subsidiary may program, further assuring that the telephone companies will never establish a bottleneck monopoly on video service. This bill also aggressively tackles the problem of cross-subsidization. While the legislation introduced last year was perfectly clear that this was illegal, this bill includes significant new assurances that there will be no cross-subsidization of cable services. The bill mandates that all telco programming be in a separate subsidiary. Further, there are strict rules forbidding cross-marketing, and perhaps most importantly is the trigger of the death penalty provision should cross-subsidy take place. In my view, it makes no sense that a telco would go to all the effort of getting into cable and then risk the enterprise to steal pennies from each consumer. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I believe that the bill we've introduced is a dramatic improvement over last year's cable telco proposal. The time is right for this subcommittee to consider legislation that would allow telephone companies to compete with the cable industry. And I just hope, Mr. Chairman, that you'll give this bill your serious consideration, that we'll be able to move forward in the process. And I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Eckert.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just make two observations. First, perhaps we ought to change the name of these events from hearings to listenings. I sometimes feel awfully sorry for the panel of distinguished witnesses who allegedly are coming here to share their knowledge with us and then are subjected to our pontificating on matters, hopefully, that have not prejudged what they've come to share with us. Secondly, I've heard this bill described so far as a cure for America's competitive position in the world, health care delivery, education, home security, and environmental protection. The only thing not mentioned so far is a cure for baldness or the heartbreak of psoriasis. Perhaps, Mr. Chairman, we ought to have the FTC come in here and testify and deal with this bill from a perspective of truth in advertising. I think there's no doubt in my mind that pieces of this legislation are going to be an important component of what we do in telecommunications policy, because frankly I think we need to move in the cable arena. I'm not quite sure how this piece fits into it. And on that note, Mr. Chairman, I will commend the witnesses for attending, and hopefully they will have a chance to share some of their knowledge with us before the morning is over.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Schaefer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To be honest, having read the findings of this legislation before us today, I would have to congratulate the sponsors in their creativity of all the things that this is going to take care of. I haven't any question that the intent of this legislation is honorable, any more so than my concerns regarding H.R. 2546 indicate a lack of interest in the future of the nation's telecommunications infrastructure. Had the legislation come with a guarantee that its real-world implementation would produce its promised results, I would stand behind no one in support of this enactment. However, until a number of critical questions are answered, the risk to the American consumer of passing the legislation is simply too great. I want to say at the outset that I agree with the premise of H.R. 2546 that a competitive solution to the imperfections in the video programming marketplace are preferable to re-regulation. But will permitting the operator of the government-selected conduit control of the content as well really result in greater competition? Or will it merely replace the current perceived monopoly with an unmistakable one? At what cost to the telephone ratepayer would this highly touted modernization take place? Estimates that I've heard place the price tag of replacing copper with fiber at $400 billion minimum. This staggering figure doesn't include the associated costs of fiber optics like devices necessary to make one's phone ring. The Consumer Federation of America put the burden on the telephone subscriber at $5 per month for the next 30 years, if they want the service or not. And I would have to say that the cable companies now are rapidly installing fiber to the curb. Assuming a nationwide fiber network offers significantly greater benefits, I'm also concerned with the timetable this legislation sets forth. Contending that we must keep pace with other industrialized nations, particularly Japan, H.R. 2546 sets a year 2015 as an essential deadline to meet. I don't know what's sacred about 2015. Rushing into a commitment of this magnitude is unwise and largely unnecessary. But if our role is to pursue the path of our neighbors, technological neighbors, it should be noted that NTT of Japan is barred from providing cable television services and cannot even lease channel capacity to unaffiliated video programmers. In closing, Mr. Chairman, I support the goals of the legislation, but I wonder whether its means will lead us to the promised end and what the cost to the consumer would be to find this out. I look forward to the testimony and yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Lehman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have a lengthy statement in writing here that explains just about everything except my position. I think I'm going to hold back on that for a while, listen to the testimony today. I'm keenly interested in this subject. I think it's of enormous importance to our country and its future. I'll submit my statement for the record and give you the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, am probably in a category of the very few members of this committee who has not really made a commitment insofar as this legislation or this issue is concerned. These hearings are designed, as Mr. Eckert said, for learning purposes and listening, and I intend to listen and try to learn before we reach the point of casting a vote. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and there's a historic new trend beginning here that are 3 members deep. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In taking the advice of my good friend from Ohio, Mr. Eckert, to heart, I will just listen and learn, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
The chair then recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope that our committee will not wait on the FCC's new rule to be implemented, because it cannot offer the relief that consumers across America need. As the Wall Street Journal and the Consumer Federation have pointed out repeatedly, we could be cutting cable bills in half. We could be saving the American consumer as much as $6 billion a year if we adopt the true competition approach. I think the Boucher-Oxley bill, of which I'm a co-sponsor, is a great start in that direction. I strongly urge this committee and this House and the other body and the White House to support full, unbridled competition in the delivery of video services to the home. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired, and all time for opening statements by members has been completed. And we will now turn to our first panel. And as we begin, I'd like to note that there is going to be another hearing in this committee at 1 o'clock this afternoon. So it was so we have to vacate before that time. And as a result, we're going to have to ask each of the witnesses on this panel and the subsequent panel to restrict their opening statements to 5 minutes so we can get to questions from the subcommittee members. So we'll be monitoring that up here, and we would ask for your cooperation in that regard. So let's turn to Janice Obachowski, who is the Assistant Secretary from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration from the U.S. Department of Commerce. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to appear before you today and state the views of the administration on H.R. 2546, the Communications Competitiveness and Infrastructure Modernization Act of 1991. Secretary Mosbacher regrets that he is unable to be present at the hearing and has asked that I read for the record a letter in which he outlines the administration's views. I will be happy to answer questions concerning these views. However, as you may be aware, because of a recusal, I have not participated in matters relating to the entry of telephone companies into video and cannot answer any questions regarding that issue except to restate the administration's position. Deputy Assistant Secretary Tom Shagru, I add parenthetically another one of the communications visionaries of the Boston College bumper crop of 1968, is with me today and is prepared to respond to any questions you may have for the administration concerning telco entry. Before reading the Secretary Mosbacher letter, I would like to congratulate the sponsors of H.R. 2546 and the subcommittee for looking at the future of the telecommunications industry from an infrastructure perspective. As you know, NTIA has been conducting a study of the nation's infrastructure since spring of 1990, and we've received a very extensive record of written comments, conducted 4 field hearings, and co-sponsored 1 symposium on rural infrastructure issues with the Annenberg program. Our report is in the final stages of preparation, and we hope to release it soon. Although it would be premature to discuss our findings in detail, I will say that our studies show, again, that Americans are increasingly using telecommunications to improve our educational system, provide better health care, and help the disabled. As importantly, advanced telecommunications is helping American business unleash its full power in the global marketplace. We have also seen that the United States telecommunications infrastructure traditionally has been the best in the world. Today, there is more question as to whether the U.S. still has the best network, and there is considerable controversy over whether the U.S. will remain at the forefront. Our own analyses show that the U.S. may lag some of our chief trading partners in the deployment of the advanced switching and signaling technologies. This is, of course, a cause for concern. Looking forward, our study will promote competition while continuing to support and expand upon the existing universal service mandate. With this preview, I would like to read Secretary Mosbacker's letter into the record. The letter is as follows and is addressed to Chairman Markey and to Mr. Rinaldo. Dear Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit for the record in this hearing the views of the administration on H.R. 2546. This bill addresses issues important to the future of our nation. We applaud the subcommittee and the bill's sponsors for taking an active interest in these issues and promote and support the deregulatory, pro-competitive goals that the bill promotes. The nation's communications infrastructure, including both mass media and telecommunications facilities, is central to supporting economic development and addressing social needs. That infrastructure is now undergoing dramatic transformation in response to advances in technology. H.R. 2546 represents a powerful vision of harnessing the convergence of video, telephone, and other services in a nationwide broadband communications system. The bill recognizes the importance of such a system to the continued economic and social health of the nation. By making it possible for telephone companies to enter into video services markets, the bill could benefit consumers through increased video competition and improved video services. Demand for such services could also stimulate further infrastructure development through the deployment of more advanced broadband technologies. While we support the basic intent of the bill, we do not agree with all of its provisions. For example, the nationwide broadband communications system described in H.R. 2546 is a laudable goal, but we do not favor mandating the establishment of such a network by a specific year. We believe that a marketplace free from restrictions on competitive entry and unnecessary regulation, as promoted by the bill, will achieve the timely deployment of a state-of-the-art network. A government-mandated schedule is neither needed or appropriate. We believe that fully competitive telecommunications markets will produce the greatest benefits for consumers and eliminate the need for extensive government regulation. Thus, the administration believes that the goals of H.R. 2546 would best be met through its deregulatory pro-competitive provisions, including the establishment of a national policy encouraging multiple uses of communications technologies. This would get government out of the business of determining which services can be delivered over which technologies. Such an approach, coupled with the adoption of regulatory reforms to increase incentives for efficiency and technology development, would be the best way of ensuring that new telecommunications technologies will truly serve the American people. Thank you for considering the views of the administration. We would be pleased to provide a further explanation of our views at your request. Sincerely, Robert A. Mosbacker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next witness is the Honorable Patricia Ticer, who is the mayor of Alexandria, who is here today representing the League of Cities.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. My name is Patsy Ticer. I am the mayor of Alexandria. I'm here today representing the League of Cities and the Conference of Mayors, and it's my pleasure to testify on this bill, which is sponsored by my fellow Virginian, Mr. Boucher and Mr. Oxley. Local governments have advocated cable legislation that would protect consumers from skyrocketing rate heights, poor customer service, and other monopoly practices. of many cable operators. In both Congress and at the FCC, local government officials have consistently argued that meaningful competition within the cable industry would increase the chances that subscribers would receive quality yet affordable cable service. We believe the most significant way that meaningful competition can occur is if there is at least one other multi-channel programming distributor offering a full array of services and programs comparable to those that the cable provides. At this time, telephone companies have the capability of being one of the few viable alternatives to traditional cable operators. In addition, telephone companies have the resources to develop, deploy, and interconnect a nationwide fiber optic system that will modernize the communications infrastructure of this country to which you have all referred. For these reasons, the League and the Conference support telco entry into the cable market, provided that appropriate regulatory conditions and safeguards are established in the right and enforced. 2546 moves in the right direction toward making the benefits of increased competition and technological innovation available to the public. The first aspect of the cable market entry proposed permits telcos to transport video programming offered by other companies on a common carrier basis, so-called video dial tone service. However, the bill exempts a telco provider of video dial tone from franchise requirements. Local governments believe this is a mistake. As a potential competitor of a franchise cable operator, it is only appropriate that the telco provider be also franchised. The second aspect of the telco entry contemplated by 2456 would allow telcos to become cable operators and to have a limited ownership interest in the programs they carry. In this regard, the bill appropriately recognizes that telcos which act as cable operators should be treated like cable operators. The bill requires telcos in this phase of market entry to be franchised and to be subject to all other appropriate franchise requirements. While the League and the Conference support the concept of allowing telcos to enter the cable market, we believe Congress should proceed cautiously in permitting telcos to own and distribute programming. Local governments strongly believe that if and when telcos begin to provide cable television service, they should do so only through a separate video programming subsidiary. We are pleased that 2546 adopts this approach and also are encouraged that the bill flatly prohibits cross-subsidization and provides other cost allocation rules to protect consumers. I have crossed out a lot because of the time limitation. The last provision which I will comment on is the multiple franchise provision that is included in H.R. 2546. Contrary to the assertions of the cable industry, the vast majority of franchising authorities across the country are open to and indeed welcome proposals for the provision of competitive cable services. A recent survey conducted by the National Association of Telecommunications Officers shows that 91% of the surveyed jurisdictions grant non-exclusive cable franchises. If a proposal for competitive cable service is submitted to a franchising authority, we believe the same conditions imposed on existing franchisees to protect the public interest should also be imposed on any new entrants. However, local governments should not be forced to award a multiple franchise to an unqualified applicant. We suggest an important modification. The bill currently lists 4 factors under which a franchising authority's refusal to award a subsequent franchise would not be considered unreasonable. We believe it is important to add this other factor, which would allow a franchising authority to refuse to grant a franchise on the ground that the proposed franchisee will not provide service to all subscribers within a franchise area on a non-discriminatory basis. Local governments must be able to ensure that all economic, social, and cultural segments of the community are afforded reasonable access to the services, information, and benefits that cable offers. Local governments believe this bill takes a positive step toward introducing competition into the monopolized industry and broadening the diversity and quality of programming available to consumers. We look forward to working with the Congress on these issues, which we think will be of benefit to the consumer in the long run. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our final witness on the first panel is Mr. Kenneth Gordon, who is the chairman of the Maine Public Utilities Commission and representing the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. Welcome, Mr. Gordon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I want to stress at the outset that the NARUC organization has not yet had a formal opportunity to consider this legislation, given the timing that's involved. And so the testimony for NARUC that I'm going to give will be reflective of concerns previously addressed by the Executive Committee resolutions of the organization, and which reflect ongoing positions of the NARUC organization. I'd like to begin by noting that the NARUC shares many of the concerns and purposes addressed by the bill. We certainly agree that the United States must fully realize the potential of new communications technologies if we are to remain competitive with the rest of the world. And indeed, I would note that the states that comprise the NARUC organization already realize the importance of these factors in their competition with each other, not to speak of the world beyond. In short, the creation of a modern, efficient, and affordable communications system is a high priority with those of us in the states. There are a number of states, some represented on the panel, on your committee, that are already deeply involved in promoting a more rapid rate of investment and innovation in new services. In a recent rate case in my state of Maine, those were the central issues for some of the parties, and indeed, in some cases, dominated concerns over the level of rates itself. And we responded. We're not alone. Tennessee, Kansas, Colorado, Pennsylvania, New York, Missouri, Michigan, and others have been moving to accelerate investment. And on the regulatory front, a number of states have been in the forefront of regulatory reform, which has as its basic purpose, I think, facilitating the process of developing a more efficient telecommunications network, and one that's more affordable for everyone. Now, having said that, I want to note that we very much appreciate that this legislation has made a very specific attempt to take into account some of the concerns of the states. We appreciate that. We are glad to have been brought into the process of working on this bill, and because we share many of the goals, we certainly look forward to continuing to work with you who are concerned with the same goals. I want to now turn to some specific comments about elements of the bill. A bedrock of concern at NARUC, of course, has long been to ensure that the states continue to be able to meet their regulatory responsibilities efficiently and effectively while cooperating with other appropriate agencies of government. Because we are assigned specific responsibilities by our legislatures, we must have the tools to carry out those responsibilities. And it's in that light that I will speak to the several sections of the bill. I'm going to move first to Title III of the bill, which addresses the cable telco cross-ownership issue. The NARUC has recognized the possible convergence of technologies and the interplay between the cable and the telephone industries, and has moved to accommodate that possibility, albeit somewhat cautiously. The reasons for the caution lie in a continuing concern by state regulators of issues of cross-subsidization, which have been already mentioned, and in addition to that, simply the sheer dollars that are involved in moving the telephone companies into this area. In March of 1988, a resolution was passed by the NARUC to the effect that if the FCC eliminates the ban on cross-ownership of cable, and by implication if the Congress were to do so, the state commissions should be allowed to determine the extent to which cross-ownership is allowed in each state. And the resolution also stated that any rule or legislation should continue to allow regulators to determine how joint and common costs will be recovered. In 1990, at the summer committee meetings in Los Angeles, another resolution dealing with cable telco cross-ownership was adopted. It urged Congress to modify the franchising requirement as it applies to the provision of video programming using telephone company facilities in order to encourage the availability of video dial tone service. Again, that resolution added a number of specifications or resolutions that the state should be given the authority to adopt the safeguards that they felt was necessary. It was also clear at those committee meetings that it was the NARUC position at that time that telephone companies should not be permitted to provide video programming themselves. There are pieces of the bill which appear to be inconsistent or possibly inconsistent with those resolutions, and to that extent the NARUC would have a concern. That debate goes on in NARUC in a fairly vigorous fashion, I would point out. It has been a subject of intense debate and controversy since I joined NARUC in 1988, and I have every expectation that it will continue to be so. And so the whole organization is going to look forward to joining with you in investigating these issues in the future. Titles 1 and 2, I would like to go back to and just say something briefly about those. I realize the time constraint. There are a number of pieces of both of those titles that we find somewhat confusing or at least a bit unclear, and which I think...
Mr. Gordon, I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt you at this point.
They have to do with the preemption question, and we'd like to investigate that much more fully, if at all possible.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. We'll turn to questions from the subcommittee at this point in time, and I'm sure that a lot of the questions which you wanted to raise, Mr. Gordon, will also be raised by the subcommittee members, and you can respond to them at that point. Chair will recognize himself. Let me begin by asking you, Ms. Obachowski, does the administration support H.R. 2546?
Mr. Chairman, at this point, the administration does not have a formal position on the legislation. We are generally supportive of its goals, but we also have questions as to the specific target date.
Well, in writing, could you send to us your analysis of each of the provisions in the bill, which of them you support, which you oppose? Could you also provide for us a written set of safeguards which you believe will be adequate in order to protect against a lot of the problems which you've heard raised this morning? And we would like that in writing if we could, and I'll send along to you a copy of our written set of questions which we would like for you to respond to us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll do that.
Again, Ms. Obachowski, as you may know, many of America's international competitors have prohibitions on telephone companies' ability to provide programming in the provision of cable services. For instance, Germany, Japan, Canada, Britain prohibit their dominant telephone companies from acting as anything other than common carriers in the provision of multi-channel video services. They are prohibited from originating video programming altogether. In Britain, common carriers cannot provide video services directly, but they are allowed to invest in cable systems through subsidiaries to deliver video services. In short, most of these countries, most of our major competitors, prohibit vertical integration of video programming, common carriage telephone service, and the integrated carriage of video services. Now, supporters of the legislation contend that it only becomes economic in the near term for our local exchange companies to bring fiber to the home if they can also originate programming carried over their lines. Could you tell us why our foreign competitors, often cited by cable telcos proponents, seem to be able to bring fiber to the home without allowing telephone companies into originating video programming?
Mr. Chairman, I will be deferring to Tom Shagru on that question.
Mr. Shagru.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. let me respond in two ways. First of all, some of our foreign competitors have a somewhat different policy than you described. For example, in the UK, the policy there is to permit telephone companies to provide cable, but after a moratorium. British Telecom will be allowed to provide cable television service after a period of time. In that country, the cable TV industry is just growing. It's just being built up. The public policy decision made in the UK was that they wanted competition between cable companies and telephone companies in provision of both what's normally called telephony in our country and what's called video services. They did provide a time certain when that restriction would be lifted. But there is a current restriction, but it's scheduled to be lifted. In other countries, they have a different system for for managing the telecommunications networks. It's a much more centralized, top-down sort of system in which results are mandated. In Japan, you can announce a goal and have investment guidelines put in, and that goal can be achieved. They also are able much more easily to adapt rules and regulations as to what can be carried and what cannot. NTT is actively pursuing possibilities of delivering video programming over their network, although they are not right now entering the cable business. They just have a different system than we do. I think it's our view that in this country, to stimulate the type of private investment we need to see, we need to have the possibility of video delivered over a broadband network.
The only point I'm trying to make here is that in Britain, although you make the point that they are presently prohibited but won't be in the future, that's 7 years down the line that prohibition is going to be lifted, and I think a lot can happen over there between now and then. In these other countries, in Germany and Japan, as you know, much of their planning is government-driven, working in coordination with the private sector, and I just wanted to get that out on the record. And what I'd like as well to ask is whether or not you've done a comprehensive study over there on what our foreign competitors are doing. Do you have anything done on that subject?
As part of our infrastructure study, we have looked at what's going on in foreign countries, and we can, that'll be part of that study when it's published.
So you've completed an in-depth analysis?
No, we have not completed.
When do you plan on completing that in-depth analysis?
During the summer, and we think we'd have it either late summer or early fall.
Okay. Well, I think that would be helpful to us in terms of our ability to make an informed decision. So if you could complete that on a timely basis, and please send it along to us, it would give us a sense as to what's going on in the rest of the world, rather than working from selective anecdotal information, which thus far has been the case. And finally, Mr. Gordon, in your testimony, you state that, quote, a bedrock of concern at NARUC has long been to ensure that the states continue to be able to meet their regulatory responsibilities efficiently and effectively. So this legislation allows the FCC to certify a local exchange company that a state regulatory agency has either disapproved or failed to act on. Do you believe that the FCC should have this authority, or should that be a state responsibility?
I think the NARUC's position would clearly be that it should be a state responsibility. Let me add, though, that I think the legislation appeared to us as we were analyzing it somewhat unclear on that point. Only if the state failed to act entirely, it appeared that the FCC would have the authority to go in. If the state were to look carefully, perhaps disapprove, then it was not clear to us what course would then ensue.
I agree with you, Mr. Gooden. I'm just as unclear with regard to what the intention is in the legislation. I think that is something that has to be further explored. And finally, you also state that the time schedule for the placement of certain technology investments called for in the legislation may make technologies obsolete before the markets develop that would use these technologies. Is it possible that this legislation is going to force investors to have their money used in plant and equipment investment that could be inefficient and obsolete?
The possibility is the concern, and I think whether that concern eventuates depends on what is meant by a plan, how flexible it is, what kind of a time schedule it has, and the like. Putting a 25-year plan in 2 years and then trying to achieve it in a somewhat rigid fashion would be very troublesome indeed, because the life of a technological generation in this particular industry is probably well under a decade. And so heaven knows, frankly, what the appropriate technologies are going to be in 5 years, much less 25.
Right. So I share the goal of gentlemen from Virginia and Ohio that we do rapidly move towards an era in which there is a fiber optic interactive capacity in every home, regardless of income in our society. But I think it is very important for us to ensure that we have safeguards for the ratepayers in place before we move forward, and that we are guaranteed that those protections are being offered at the federal and state and local levels to the ratepayers. Otherwise, I'm afraid that there would be too much temptation for cross-subsidization or investment in technologies that may not be the most appropriate long-term. My time has expired. Turn and recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Oxley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm only sorry my colleague from Ohio had to leave and miss this excellent testimony from our witnesses. Perhaps he'll be back for the second panel. Let me first ask Mr. Gordon, you represent a state that has a lot of rural areas, beautiful state that I've visited on occasion, and what advantage do you see in our legislation or any type of legislation that would encourage the growth of broadband networks in the service to rural areas?
Clearly, the telephone company has the broadest reach in a state like mine at the moment, and in recognition of the importance of that, we have pushed ahead. We are one of the states that has pushed ahead in deploying fiber optic, digitization, and so on in the state. As I alluded very briefly in my testimony, we had a rate case in which those were issues of paramount concerns to parts of the public sector, parts of the private sector, business customers, and the like. And we did, in fact, respond to that. We allowed for an acceleration of that kind of deployment. Whether we did not, of course, have the option in Maine of even considering whether or not video ought to play a role in that. The current legal status of that precludes any such consideration. But we did think that the deployment of the infrastructure is extremely important. We've begun to use it in education and in other ways in the state, and we think it's a worthwhile way to go.
You had testified earlier that there's a great deal of difference of opinion among the NARUC people. And I know you were today testifying on behalf of NARUC, and you've obviously had some experience in this area. I wondered if you'd care to give us perhaps some of your personal opinions on this legislation and perhaps some suggestions as to how we might make it better or make it more effective.
Okay. Keeping in mind that I am speaking somewhat for myself here, I do think that the concerns, some of the concerns about the lack of clarity of whether or not states are preempted, and I think the written testimony will suggest that that's the major concern. It's very hard to tell just what the state role will be, particularly in Titles I and Title II of the bill. And so I do think myself that needs to be worked through, clarified, made a little bit sharper and more pointed. In terms of the question of cable telephone cross-ownership, I would note that the NARUC organization, neither the Communications Committee nor the Executive Committee has had a chance to look at the particular protections against cross-subsidy that are enumerated in the bill. And until that's done, I can't presume to speak for the organization, but I can suspect that we will take a close look at those. As the concerns with cross-subsidization, if they can be met, and if the states can be assured of some reasonable role then it may be possible to move forward in a little bit different direction than the NARIC has. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen or when it's going to happen, but I think, assure you that we're going to continue to look very closely at this issue, because the concerns that I said we support, we really do, and I do think we want to see a modern telecommunications infrastructure.
Well, I appreciate that. I know that your governor, our former colleague, Governor McKernan, has taken a good leadership role in this. As a matter of fact, I think he's chairman of one of the governor's conferences
He was chairman of the telecommunications subcommittee.
Right, and has expressed an interest and an enlightened viewpoint on this, and I appreciate your being here. Let me just ask Ms. Obashowski, based on the letter from the Secretary, it appears that the major hang-up that he has and the administration has with the legislation is the target date, if you will, and that overall the concept, particularly as opposed to the re-regulatory scheme, is one that can be supported strongly by the administration. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement. Would Tom like to amplify on it?
That is a fair statement, yes.
Give the man a raise.
Thank you. Let me ask you, Mayor, you had expressed an interest in a franchise arrangement.
Yes.
As I understand it, even for a video dial tone kind of a concept. Is that?
That's right. We basically are, as you might expect, looking for local control to protect our consumers and our
constituents. How would you protect them?
Well, we would, if we had the franchise, we would have them before us, and we would be making certain stipulations as to whom they would serve, just what they would do. Now,
well, even if they were just simply a common carrier as opposed to providing a video program, I don't think we have any argument, Mr. Chairman, with the cities in regard to franchising arrangements as they would with a cable television service. But specifically in the area of video dial tone, it seems to be rather incongruous that the cities would demand some kind of a franchise arrangement and a fee, I assume, for providing common carrier status.
I am going to defer to my assistant here, who is Stephanie Phillips from Arnold & Porter, who is employed by the League of Cities and the U.S. Conference of Mayors, if I may. Stephanie?
Thank you. Well, there are a number of requirements that local governments feel are necessary to protect the public interest, including access requirements for public, educational, and governmental users, consumer protection requirements, customer service requirements, and to the extent that any new facilities are built, then local governments have an interest in ensuring that the facilities are built in a safe and reasonable manner, and that they are able to regulate the use and construction that goes on public streets.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Scheuer.
Madam Mayor, 2556 doesn't require telcos to enter into franchising agreements, as I understand it, with local authorities. Now, your testimony is critical of this aspect of the bill. It does, of course, require the telcos to submit a plan to state public utilities and also to the FCC. And it does contain punitive measures so that if the carrier abuses their well, it's not a franchise, but it's an entry. If they abuse the privilege that they've been given to serve, there are punitive provisions. Why is this combination of supervision from the state agency, the utility commissions, and from the FCC not sufficient to the need thereof?
Well, I think that Stephanie really just responded to Mr. Oxley's question on that, and it's a matter of local control. It's a matter of flexibility that local government is constantly advocating for. It's service where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. It is our constituents who are calling us because something is going wrong. Something can go wrong with any aspect of the service. It would be nice to have the authority to have some sort of voice in setting up that service. I think it's as simple as that. Whether it's a franchise or whether it is another mechanism for allowing a local voice, I don't think it makes any difference. But we are not always totally of the same mind as our State Corporation Commission, for instance. And in Virginia, our State Corporation Commission might allow some things that we on the local level would not choose. So I think it's basically a local voice is what I'm referring to.
Well, is it a local voice or is it local control? Let me just say that if you look at the history of municipal control of private industry, it's a dicey record. If you look back over 100 years, you find a record of municipal abuses as long as your arm. And I wonder if we're moving toward a national system, and there is a state voice and there is a federal voice, if you're going to have local control, is that going to provide such a thicket of dissonant voices out there that it's going to be very difficult for private industry to move, especially if we're trying to achieve some kind of a broad-based national system. If we have a vision, as I think this bill does, of a broad-based national system, I raised the question to you as to whether, if you already have one national voice in there, the FCC, and 50 or 51 state voices, if you're going to include the District of Columbia, if you're going to add a municipal voice and a municipal control, isn't that going to provide real problems for the industry in moving and real problems for our country to move toward some kind of a uniform, integrated national system?
Well, Congressman, I feel that it's a matter of equity. It's not only a matter of equity, and when you're talking about who is having a say in what's happening in our own communities, but it's a matter of equity with the current cable providers, because the current cable systems have to go through the franchise regulatory process. And so why would you give preference to one provider over the other? I think it's a matter of equity, too, in terms of public rights-of-way, things that we, on a local level, have not only have control over, but we have consideration for our citizens about. So I think it really goes back to where the action is. I certainly condone the goal of this legislation, which is to modernize the industry. But I think just as important a goal is to provide a competitive atmosphere. Now, if there's a competitive...
Are you suggesting, Madam Mayor, are you suggesting that the FCC and the state regulatory agencies between them can provide the kind of regulatory environment that you're speaking of that does assume that equity and fairness is a #1 goal? Are the federal government agencies and the states incapable of providing
I certainly
that?
do not want to be in a position of saying that those are not certainly adequate forms of control, but I do want to say that is in any instances that affect the lives of our citizens and the pocketbooks of our citizens, we who are hearing from them on a daily basis would like to be involved in the process. I do not think that the FCC is hearing from my constituent about bad cable service or the cost having risen 37% since 1988, when the Consumer Price Index has increased only 12%. That is the kind of thing that we are hearing at the local level. That's the thing that in fact, was involved in a recent local campaign. So you can't expect us to take, to bear the burden of an efficient system and explaining an efficient system without any authority over it. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to discuss a little bit about this joint federal-state board where the FCC and the utility commissions would work together to stimulate the national network. And maybe Mr. Shagru, Mr. Gordon could comment here a little bit. We would seek uniformity of standards for interconnection. Is that a reasonable assumption, and would that be reasonably accepted by the state utility commissions, this kind of seeking out of a uniform set of standards that all 50 states would engage in, so that we would not have unique and different situations, unique and different costs, and far higher costs across the country? Is that reasonable?
We certainly are comfortable with the need for standards for nationwide interoperability. Absolutely.
Would you be comfortable with federal preemption of, in a sense of giving the FCC some greater authority to define these standards so as to get expeditious attainment of this uniformity?
I think if it were demonstrated that that were needed, that there was in fact a problem with different states or different telephone companies moving in opposite directions with respect to, say, technical standards, I think that and this is speculation of course, but I think the NARUC would see that as a case where the federal government might have to have the preeminent role.
What about on depreciation rates for plant and equipment? You see a lot of different models in a lot of different states, and of course different states have different circumstances within their border, but in order to, again, to achieve expeditious national network, it might be that certain states are more advanced in their thinking, more prone to want to be part of a national system, and other states would care less. I mean, how do you see getting some kind of uniformity and kind of expeditious achievement of a rational schedule for depreciation if we are going to seek national network?
Two comments. That obviously touches on the core of states' rate-making authority, and I think the position of the NARUC would be quite clear on that we need to retain the authority to determine depreciation rates for the intrastate portion of telephone investment. I'm also in the happy circumstance of coming from Maine, where we are regularly pressing for faster depreciation in the three-way meetings than we get out of the FCC and the other participants. So it's not obvious to me that having the federal government do it would necessarily get it moving as rapidly as some of us would like to see.
Mr. Shagru, do you want to make a comment on that?
Yes.
Or Ms. Wachowski, if you
on interconnection and interoperability, I think you do need national standards, even for something as simple as customer premises equipment, simple telephones, fax machines, etc. The FCC did specify the rules on a preemptive basis in the 1970s, and that I don't think we'd have the market we have today without it. It's worked very well, and after some initial sort of turmoil, the states seem to agree with that. So I think that is fine, and I think the FCC probably has jurisdiction now to do that, but it wouldn't hurt, I suppose, to clarify. As Mr. Gordon pointed out, depreciation is a very sensitive topic. It is precisely the issue the FCC lost a Supreme Court case on with respect to its preemptive authority. So I think it's fair to say it does not have that authority now under the Communications Act. Congress could give it the authority. I think constitutionally there's no problem with that. When I look at what's happening in the states, though, I while there are differences, as you point out, it's not quite as wide as perhaps some people anticipated, including myself. Many states like Maine are quite happy with, indeed pushing for, accelerated depreciation. And the concern the FCC had that the states would really uniformly be lagging behind what technology was demanding just hasn't come to pass yet. So it may be a more theoretical problem than a practical one.
I thank the chairman. It has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Bauscher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I join with you in thanking all of these witnesses for their well-considered and prepared testimony this morning. Ms. Ticer, without asking a question, let me just say for the record and to clarify for everyone who's interested in the general subject that with regard to franchises, we do not require that the telephone companies receive a franchise as long as they are simply operating under what we call the video dial tone service, meaning that if they're carrying someone else's signal, a signal over which they have no control in terms of content, have no ownership rights, then a franchise would not be required. If, however, the telephone company moves to the next step, our bill says that it must then get a franchise, as would any other cable operation, and that next step is where the telephone company does have some programming opportunities on its own, whether by ownership or packaging or some other way. And I just wanted to clarify that because in the general debate, I'm not sure that point was made.
Thank you.
Let me propound a question to Mrs. Obuchowski and Mr. Shagru. At the outset, I want to thank both of you for the kind words that you had to say about the legislation this morning, and also the kind words of Secretary Mosbacher. And in referring to his comments, I noticed that he says that while he supports the general thrust of the bill, that there are certain provisions in it that give him pause, and one of those, in fact the only one really mentioned, is the mandate of deployment of technology by a year certain, and that year in our bill is 2015. Would it satisfy the administration and would it open the path to a complete endorsement of our measure if we altered that provision, essentially to say that the only time that telephone companies would have any requirement to prepare and file a plan of scheduled deployment, the only time that plan would have to receive approval from a regulatory authority, either state or federal, would be in the event that the telephone company seeks to offer television service. That way, we would withhold conferring a privilege on the telephone industry that it doesn't have today, dependent on its stated willingness to deploy fiber optics on a schedule that would roughly keep us in parity with the Japanese, that being the year they've picked. Mr. Shagru.
Mr. Boucher, I think that would be a move in the right direction from the administration's point of view. Obviously, I can't tell you exactly what our position is. We haven't considered that as an option, but it certainly removes one of the concerns, which is sort of a forced march specified by government to a particular outcome by a particular time, which gave us some discomfort. So an opt-in approach in which the telephone company looked at its options, said, we think this makes sense for us, we're willing to commit to X in return for Y, I think would solve some of our problems.
All right. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, those are the only questions I have of this panel.
The gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bill Rackus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gordon, as you know, the bill includes numerous safeguard provisions to ensure that telephone companies, or at least intended to ensure that telephone companies, if allowed into the business, do not cross-subsidize their regulated telephone exchange service costs with unregulated video programming costs. Do you, as a member of the PUC, do you believe that these safeguard provisions will be sufficient to prevent cross-subsidies?
This is just giving my own reaction to
well,
that.
Giving
I think they are a substantial. I think they're a very substantial step toward doing that, as a matter of fact. And I think our ability to deal with cross-subsidy has probably been improving lately, partly under the prompting of needing to have it improve. But I do think it has. And as we get more effective in controlling cross-subsidy, then weighing those kinds of costs against possible benefits might lead to a different calculus. As I pointed out, obviously the NARUC organization has not had a chance to look at these specific safeguards and how they might fit in. I think the primary concern would be that the states do retain a role in this, because we have observed and had to deal with cross-subsidization on a number of occasions or other kinds of practices, and we just want to be sure that we are a part of whatever's in place to deal with those things.
Well, all right, you want to be sure of that, but what efforts have been made by you personally or by the association? There's a National Association of Public Utility Commissioners, or whatever the title is. Do you know if any efforts have been made for an input on their part towards this legislation?
On this particular legislation, I did not participate in the drawing up of the legislation, so I haven't done so directly. It may be that other state commissioners were directly involved, and I simply don't know about it. We obviously discuss the matter regularly at our annual meetings. We discuss issues such as the use of separate subsidiaries as a mechanism within our own region, the NYNEX region for the telephone company. We've been looking very specifically at protections having to do with access to accounts and records, the use of separate subsidiaries, incentive mechanisms designed to focus management attention on the concerns that we have, and so on. That's been going on in New York, and it's also been going on in New England, both components of NYNEX. And so, yes, we have been looking at these kinds of issues, trying to find mechanisms which will allow companies to go forward, do new things, take advantage of new opportunities, and at the same time continue to protect ratepayers and make sure that they don't backstop these efforts if they go awry.
All right, but from your experience, sir, we're an ivory tower here. I guess in many instances we don't do too bad of a job, considering we don't have the benefit of the actual down on grassroots, practical, real-world experience, and in many cases we don't do a very good job not having had that experience. But from your standpoint and the experiences that you have had, and you've read this legislation, have you? If you were king and had the opportunity to submit suggestions to us in terms of maybe additional changes or additional regulatory protections, if any, et cetera, what would they be?
Okay, I haven't put together a list of it.
Pardon me?
I haven't put together a list of additional protections that I would have, and as I looked at the legislation, frankly, it appeared to me that a number of them are exactly the sort of things that states would want to be doing themselves and involved in. So I don't have any complaint about the particular protections. We have had protections in the past. We've seen problems, and making the protections work is something that we think we need to be involved in.
Okay, but you have, if we ask you, for instance, to submit for the record any additional recommendations and whatnot towards that end, would you be prepared to do that?
I'd be delighted to do so.
Okay. I would ask unanimous consent that the gentleman have the opportunity to do that, Mr. Chairman. It might give some help.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, sir.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Lehman.
Mr. Chairman, I've enjoyed the hearing this morning. First, I'd like to make maybe 3 brief observations. The first is that I think this legislation and the one tomorrow are very closely related, and it's not directly, but I think it's impossible to consider one without the other. If we're going to talk about re-regulating the industry, this new scheme we're going to possibly impose on entry has to be factored in with that as well. Second, I think the cable companies here are in a rather unenviable position in this regard, in having to oppose both the telco entry into their business and the regulation of their business on the other side. And that's a pretty difficult burden to bear. I'm sure their representatives will acquit themselves well, but it's difficult. Third, I think we're talking here, as I hear it, about much more than just whether or not we're going to allow the telephone companies into the cable business. So we're really talking about taking a step toward the eventual integration of our information, communication, and entertainment services. And something probably much bigger and much different than any of us immediately imagined, something that's very exciting but is obviously going to cause in the short term a good deal of dislocation as we go forward, building on an infrastructure that is archaic and completely inadequate, as many of our other infrastructures are in this country. It suggests banking and energy are two similar ones. I guess the first question I'd maybe like to ask the administration, the arguments for competition here notwithstanding, do you think that the telco entry into the cable business will inevitably mean telco dominance of the cable business? And are we just replacing one small set of players here with maybe a fewer number of much larger players with more money?
No, I don't think that is the outcome. I think this bill and the administration's proposals in this area are a pro-competitive approach. In particular, the common carriage aspect of the underlying facilities, in which there would be sort of an equal access or open network approach to the video distribution system, is one that I think will very much stimulate competition. That is, anyone could get access to the telephone company's facilities to deliver their own programming, which is a distinction from the current system. The cable company, as a First Amendment speaker, has editorial control over who gets access to its wires. There is sort of a debate among regulatory historians as to how that developed and whether that was a good idea 20 years ago, but that's the way it developed and that's the way it'll stay. The telephone company entry into this business would follow a different model, and we think a pro-competitive one.
What's the voucher legislation has some limitations on the ability of the telcos to own and control programming. Does the administration support those? Do you think it's proper to have a boundary out there?
Well, there are some provisions like requirements for separate subsidiaries and things like that. I think our view on that is that would be better left to the FCC and the expert regulatory agencies to assess the costs and benefits of that. It's something they do on a regular basis. There are costs to strict separation, and putting them in legislation where it's very hard to change or to fine-tune might not be the best idea. Having said that, a separate subsidiary for programming activities is probably not terribly inefficient because those really would involve separate facilities, separate people. The overlap between the two activities isn't significantly great, I would offer. However, I think the administration's position is that would be better left to the regulatory agencies.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to ask the mayor, if I might. Currently, under the system that we have, the cable companies don't automatically come in and hook up to every house in the neighborhood or every neighborhood. One obvious thing you notice right off the bat is that we require the phone company to be everywhere. Or almost everywhere, Mr. Cooper. Do you see this legislation as possibly furthering that goal and making it universally available?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Do things need to be done here to strengthen that possibility?
I do, and while there's a provision of the bill that prohibits the telcos from purchasing cable companies, existing cable companies, I think that that there should be some little out for that, not something that would allow, in dire circumstances, in the far reaches of a rural area where the telephone company is and where a cable company has gone in and failed, the possible picking up of that cable company by the telephone company, which would mean the only service available to those people in Nebraska or wherever. I think that should be, there should be some kind of stopgap measure there. But I do agree with you. I think it would be more democratic. I think it's the possibility of everyone having access to the service. I think the educational aspects of the service are extraordinarily important now, and they're important for all parts of our communal life other than just our competitiveness with Japan. Of course, we are competing with Japan and with other countries on all levels, certainly in education, and the technology is important for that. I would like to answer or speak to just just for a second Chairman Markey's question about the other countries, because I have been in a couple of those other countries recently, and maybe it would help their programming if they allowed the telephone company to get involved, because currently they cannot possibly compete with the offerings in our country. If you look for something in London to watch, it is absolutely pitiful. So I think that, you know, there may be some extenuating circumstances that should provide for flexibility and creativity in our country.
Yeah. I walked over and said the same thing to Mr. Boucher during the question, but I didn't use the word pitiful.
Thank you.
My time's expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Schaefer.
Thank you, Chair. The witnesses that we have today. H.R. 2546 purports to modify the impediments to convergence of telephone and video technologies. With regard to the telephone companies, the bill is very specific and mandates a federal policy of permitting the telephone companies into video information services. 2546, however, does not address equitably the issue of cable entry into the telephone business. Since telephone monopolies are granted by the states and the bill does not preempt state regulatory impediments to the cable entry into the telephone service, would you agree the bill does nothing to allow cable companies into the telephone business or to promote multiple use of the broadband fiber infrastructure which cable companies are now installing all around the country? Anyone?
Yes.
Well, I certainly agree that the bill doesn't let cable companies into the telephone industry. I think that I have NARIC has not commented on, we haven't discussed that issue. I have a personal position based on years ago being an academic economist, and I think I'd better let that opinion rest there. I think the state would be concerned, I think the state legislature would be concerned if we were to simply try to move in that direction without a great deal of thought. And I suspect also that NARIC would have some concerns of that, but we do not have a position on that.
Whether you have a position or not is not addressed in this bill.
It appears not to be.
Anyone else like to make comment on this, please?
Well, I don't think it's addressed directly, but the provision establishing a national policy favoring multiple uses of technology, telecommunications technology, at least I would read to be not just limited to technology owned by telephone companies, but technology generally. So I think that's an endorsement, although there's nothing in the bill saying we're going to lift restrictions on cable entry into telephone service. So and just to add a little point, there are movements at the state level and at the federal level to permit more competition in the local exchange area. Both states and the FCC have recently taken a number of actions in that regard to permit more competition, including the granting of experimental personal communications, that's radio-based local services, to a number of cable companies. So there is some movement, even though you're quite right, the bill doesn't say these restrictions shall be lifted upon enactment.
Well, as long as we're onto that subject, don't you feel that in the interest of true competition that we should have it both ways in this bill? Let's take the rural areas that was mentioned by the mayor. If a telephone company is in there into a particular rural area, in some places the telephone company does actually own cable. Would it not also be vice versa and allow the cable to get in the telephone?
I think, let me just first say the administration doesn't have a formal position on that, but I think it would be, those arguments are generally consistent with a pro-competitive approach to this marketplace. So I think it's something we'll have to look at. We do have, as I said, an infrastructure review that's examining a broad range of policies at NTIA, and the Vice President's Competitiveness Council is also looking at these issues, and that'll be one we will be addressing.
Would the mayor like to comment? Yes, ma'am.
Very briefly, the League and the Conference of Mayors have not taken a position on such competition, but it's always been their position. It's always been their general position to foster more competitiveness. So I think they would look upon it favorably.
You wouldn't mind seeing language to that nature into this particular piece of legislation, then?
I don't think so.
While I have you the Honorable Mayor here. You quoted a survey which showed that 91% of the surveyed jurisdictions grant non-exclusive cable franchises. I'd ask then, why are there not more cable overbuilds? If the economics aren't there to support more than one cable operator in a franchise area, shouldn't we be concerned that this legislation could merely replace one video programmer with another, somewhat in line with the gentleman from California's question?
I think that is the that concern and fear has been expressed by almost every speaker today, including every member of your subcommittee, is replacing one monopoly with another. And I think it's extremely important that we watch this bill and add to this bill and make suggestions to it for anything that might control that. I don't have the answer to that.
So we could just be substituting one
well,
monopoly with
I
another?
don't believe
so.
so.
Where
I
would
believe
we be?
there are, as Mr. Gordon says, he believes that there are safeguards written into the bill. And I have to tell you that I am relying on the staff work of my colleagues with the League of City and the Conference of Mayors, because I have not gone over this bill with a fine-tooth comb. But I would be happy to do so, and I'd be happy to have someone on my staff do so. And we would give you additional suggestions on that.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cooper, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. I'd just like to ask my colleague from Colorado, who's already disappeared, it looks like, oh, I missed my chance. I should have intervened earlier. Well, I'll ask my question in his absence. I was just wondering how friendly his suggestion was to the legislation, whether he would in fact support the voucher bill if we made it a two-way street and allowed cable companies to get into the telephone business. My guess is, and I don't want to be unfair to the gentleman, that even with the addition of that amendment, he would be most opposed to the legislation. I have no further points to make, Mr. Chairman. I'll go back to balance my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Toza. I mean, a gentleman from Louisiana, Mr.
Really,
Toza.
really denigrated the state of Tennessee. Louisiana, sir, the state that's somebody's in half underwater and half under indictment this morning. we got our problems, you know. We got our problems. Somebody has the only state with a governor's election right now where the top 3 leading contenders all have negatives higher than their positives. It's amazing. Strange situation. Let me take you on a journey just for a second. We passed this legislation. We've got full-blown telco entry into video services. They're programming now, their own program. They're in the marketplace. What I hear from the administration is that you would rather see that world than a world of re-regulation of the cable. That world of full-blown telco entry with programming, ownership, origination, competition would be better for the consumer than simply re-regulating cable at any level. But what I'm hearing from all of you is that even in that new world, that brave new world of competition, all of you want a piece of regulation. All of you want to regulate again. Which way is it going to be? If we choose a world of competition, telco entry, fiber networks competing with one another, with all these new services, if that's going to be what the consumer needs, why do you all compete this morning for a piece of the regulatory action here? Any of you want to try it?
Okay, Tom, I'll go first. I guess the concern is the degree to which you really have the kind of competition that I think we all really do want to have and that we'd like to be able to rely on. I think on first blush, as if it were to be if your scenario were to work out, then we'd be concerned about what was actually going on. And I think, frankly, you would be too, because what you'd really want to see happening would be people playing on a I hate to use it, but I'm going to, I guess, a level playing field, and I don't mean one that was artificially levelized, but just a true level playing field. And you won't know that unless you have the ability to keep an eye on what's going on, at least in the early stages of the process. I think if it appears to be going okay, I personally would be happy to withdraw from that arena, but I'd have a show-me attitude, I think, for a while at least.
You can try it. Isn't the real reason that we're talking about a new competitor who is engaged in regulated activities? And it has to be regulated anyhow. So you're going to regulate its entry and its participation in this new competitive world. If that's true, if that's the reason, then why do we keep shouting this benefit to the consumer of competition when all we're talking about is a new player, perhaps a substitute player, who's got to be regulated even more than the old player? Anyone?
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Ms. Tyser, please.
I would say that in a perfect world, as Mr. Gordon said, you would not need any regulation because competition would be pure, but it's not. Competition is very weighted in every level of life, and that's one of the responsibilities of government, I think, is to give people choices. I think that's one of our primary responsibilities, is to, as it is possible, to level the playing field so that people may not have exact equal opportunity, but they do have choices in their lives. And I think that's really the essence of what we're talking about here, is trying to level the playing field for our consumer. And I might add something that I'd forgotten earlier, that in New York State, the local governments do franchise. Competition is very weighted in every level of life, and that's one of the responsibilities of government, I think, is to give people choices. I think that's one of our primary responsibilities, is to, as it is possible, to level the playing field so that people may not have exact equal opportunity, but they do have choices in their lives. And I think that's really the essence of what we're talking about here, is trying to level the playing field for our consumer. And I might add something that I'd forgotten earlier, that in New York State, the local governments do franchise the telephone companies, and it is successful. So it's not unheard of that these franchises function effectively and really for the benefit of the citizen of the locality.
But here's the dilemma we face. We're supposed to be all acting for the benefit of the consumer. We want the consumer to get the best kind of new technology and competition and choice. That's been our guiding light in terms of policy discussions here. But according to the AARP study done by Mr. Cooper, Mark Cooper, what we're talking about is a possibility, at least, of having ratepayers and absorb all kinds of new cost and a problem of subsidization that doesn't exist today. When we allow a new player in the field who may, in fact, simply end up replacing the old player, and we end up with a need to regulate even greater than we had before. That would be the worst possible scenario for consumers, I think, and we need to avoid it. Isn't there a possible alternative? Let me just lay it on the table and maybe get you to feedback on me. My understanding is that there are currently restrictions on joint venturing at the FCC, that telephone companies can't really joint venture with cable companies. And if we really want in America to avoid the extra cost of competing fiber optic platforms and the excessive cost of regulating against cross-subsidization, always policing that effort, wouldn't at least the first step, and perhaps a good step, be to engage a discussion of lifting that joint venture prohibition and allowing telephone companies to joint venture with cable companies so that we have a single fiber optic platform from which both services are delivered, but not necessarily by the same party in the joint venture? wouldn't that kind of, at least the first step, perhaps avoid some of the problems that the AARP study has indicated could occur?
Gentleman's time has expired, but the witnesses will be allowed to respond to the question if you could in a brief form.
If I could, lifting that restriction, I don't know that telephone companies will become Paramount Pictures if this bill were to pass. I think they would enter through joint ventures with various program providers, including cable companies, including perhaps independent telephone companies, which was raised earlier, who are experts at putting together packages of programming that are attractive to consumers. Our support for regulation, we think, is a focused one. There's a lot of talk in this area about separating content from conduit. We want to regulate the conduit because right now we see that's the source of market power, monopoly power. We don't want to regulate the content providers. We think that the competition can thrive there. And if we get competition in the local exchange market, that has also been raised, and maybe we don't need to regulate the conduit either, but at least as an interim step, we think focusing competition there, regulation on the conduit's the right answer, and that'll stimulate competition in the delivery of content.
I find myself in a unique position of agreeing with the administration.
Yeah, I don't think I disagree either. I don't think the kind of cross-subsidization concerns are inevitable. It's just that we've had some bad experience, and I think the general bias toward entry, wherever that appears feasible, is probably a better one than to have the bias always to keep it regulated and keep a particular market isolated.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Moorhead.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we expand the number of outlets and the number of available sources of programming that we have in the United States, the cost of programming seems to be climbing. And one problem is that, especially for the networks, they're having a struggle getting the advertising dollars that they need in order to pay for quality programming. That same problem is going to exist with cable and other services. If we expand too far and too fast, are we not in danger of getting a lot of mediocre programming on hundreds of different channels that are available, but very little first-class programming available for the American people? Mr. Gordon?
I guess my reaction to that, and this is not something on which NARUC has any position that I know of, is that the cost of programming probably is a reflection of the demand for it by consumers through the advertising mechanism. My views on the availability of a supply of quality programming, I'm not sure what that depends on. As many people think there's a lot of fairly average programming out there, or worse, out there already. I think that as long as the opportunity is there for people to find additional outlets, that process will sort itself through. The ratio of top programming to more run-of-the-mill programming has always been small. What I guess I don't see is why any particular medium wouldn't get its proportionate share, wouldn't be able to get a hold of its proportional share of whatever really good programming there was available.
Would somebody else like to comment on that too?
Yes, Mr. Moorhead, I was happy to hear that this is probably the first issue in the whole of communications that NARUC doesn't have a position on. They generally, but we don't think a competitive market would lead to mediocre programming. We think that's not the experience we found in other markets. We do see with the proliferation of cable stations some what they call narrowcasting, programming that's focused on people with particular interests, and that people without those interests may consider it sort of uninteresting programming, but those who enjoy it and want it find it very interesting. I'm a sports fan, and I enjoy watching a half hour of 11 o'clock news devoted to baseball. My wife thinks that's the dumbest thing that ever came along. And other than a fight over what goes on the TV, I think it's probably salutary that we have a choice at 11 o'clock for those people who want to get all the highlights from around the country, and someone else can watch other things. So I don't think I would not characterize our experience as one of sort of sinking to a level of mediocrity in programming.
May May I add to that just a little bit? I think that access, competitive access, will improve the programming, and it certainly is my fervent hope that it will. I currently have a request from an Arab organization that would like to have a channel on our local cable television, and we've been told that there is no more space, no more airspace. And to me, this, I think it's a very valid. We have a fairly high percentage in our Arab, we have a high Arab community percentage of our population are Arab, and I feel that this would be, this is something that would serve the public. So I would like to have more access to more channels.
I would hope it would provide more jobs to the people out in my area where we make
Right,
the movies
right.
programming also.
Yeah.
There was one question that has been alluded to a number of times, but I don't think exactly answered. That relates to the conflict between regulation and competition. There's a threat of a veto on more regulation, as you know. So we may not be able to get to that point. Do you believe that this legislation, if it's enacted into law, will at least cover most of the area that needs to be provided to discipline the cable industry into keeping their rates in line and their service at a high quality? Will it accomplish that or most of the objective?
If I may, I have read quite a bit on this issue, and just with the threat of competition, cable companies have improved their programming. They have, in many cases, decreased their rates and their service also. I think that the answer is yes. I think that this bill is a valiant effort toward that end, and with maybe a few modifications, it could do just that.
Any other wish to make a comment to it?
I'd like to agree with my mayor. I'm a resident of Alexandria and endorse her views on that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the bill contains elements which, if coordinated properly with state regulation, are the sorts of things that regulators do look for to handle these problems. And I'd just offer the comment that it's the transition. Regulation is fairly easy and competition is fairly easy. It's when you're trying to transition between the two that becomes extraordinarily difficult.
Thank you. I see I have the red light, so I yield back what balance of time I may have.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes now the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. McMillan.
I thank the chairman, and as I've said many times in these hearings before, I think this issue is one of our most critical for our country in terms of establishing a telecommunications infrastructure as we get further into the information age. It rivals the building of canals, the building of railroads, the building of our highways as a historical importance to this country. As we race towards this fiber optics infrastructure, I think you have to ask yourself basic questions. Will it occur without change in public policy? The answer is probably not. Will the cable companies or the telcos do it without some change in current policy in terms of keeping up with international timetables that the Japanese and others are setting? And the answer to that is probably not. So we want to talk about moving forward and establishing even playing fields and competitive access, as you referred to. One of the things that I'm concerned about is I see cable moving into PCNs and personal communication networks. I'm concerned that there could be cross-subsidization of those experiments. Is that fair? I'm also concerned about cable getting directly into phone areas. I was reading the Wall Street Journal about cable company Cox Enterprises buying into Teleport Communications Corporation, which is very much involved in fiber optics and bypass and going to businesses and the like, exactly what the phone companies are doing. Is that the kind of policy that's haphazard or irrational policy that's right for this country, or should we be rationalizing this, as my colleague from Virginia is trying to do, And I would like to ask the Secretary, is this and I know that, I don't know if you're answering these questions, but is this the kind
I can answer. I believe I can answer this.
Is this a kind of even playing field that is right for us to reach the end target?
Well, you're absolutely right that you see multiple trends and technology convergence trends, and certainly the Cox very aggressive entry into the local exchange is a harbinger of I think, a trend that will grow in the future. We do think that this whole area has to be looked at comprehensively, and that's why at NTIA we've been doing this infrastructure study, trying to be sure that we don't have a national policy that evolves in a piecemeal fashion, and I think that's why the Secretary in his letter concerning this bill was very complimentary of its attempt to begin to broaden out the issues.
Any other comments on that point?
No, I don't. I'd endorse that. I think that it's a very complicated area. The whole areas of technology that we're not clear where they're going. One that has not been mentioned at all here this morning, although Secretary Obuchowski has been a leader in the area, is the whole role of spectrum and how that policy will dovetail with these other developments in communications, just to pick one. It's very hard to lay out a hard and fast plan at the moment, but having a structure within which people can make decisions knowing how the rules are going to work is of enormous value.
Seems to me that seems to me technology, or the points you referred to, is leading us down a piecemeal approach, pell-mell towards a dual system, but not a very rational system in terms of competitiveness, in terms of fairness, and all the other standards. And so, I think that this is one of the most, as I said before, one of the most critical issues that face this country, and certainly rivals in historical importance a lot of things that we've done. And so I commend the Chairman for, again, moving the frontier on these issues. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired, as has all time for the opening panel. Let me make this note, though. It's that some of the points that Mr. McMillan were raising are central, as many other issues that other members have raised. We have questions of cross-subsidy by telephone companies of their cable initiatives, but we have the converse problem of subsidy of telephone service by cable, all possible within the next several years. And as a result, we have to have more firm answers that come forward from the federal, state, and local regulators with regard to the system of checks and balances, safeguards that would be building into any modern telecommunications system which we would construct. We want to work with each of you as we're moving forward. And what I'd like to ask is that each of you right now give me your 1-minute statement in summation of what it is that you want us to keep in mind as we're moving forward on legislation in these areas this year. Let's begin with you, Mr. Gordon.
Thank you. I guess the single most important thing that I think the Congress, that's within the Congress's power to accomplish, is to try and get a clearly stated set of guidelines, a clearly stated framework, because only when that is done will private investment be able to move forward, and it is private investment that's going to build the infrastructure as it does evolve.
Okay. Mr. Segru? Ms. Obuchowski.
One of the great visionaries in this field, a former MIT professor, talked about telecommunications as offering technologies for freedom. And we need to keep getting back to that idea that this infrastructure is here to promote the freedom and the strength of our country, healthcare, education, transportation. We've heard them all today, and so our parting thought as an administration is to congratulate the committee for taking this comprehensive view of these technologies and the opportunities they'll be affording American citizens. Thank you.
And Mayor Tyson.
Thank you, Chairman Markey. It's been my pleasure to have the opportunity to appear before you today. And I think that I think there's a general agreement around the table that competition is good, and certainly that is our goal, is to foster competition, and by doing so, reducing rates and increasing the quality of the service that our consumers are receiving. And all I would leave you with is just to implore you to try to make sure that within this bill there is a balance of regulatory oversight by all three parts, or a checks and balance system, as you said, the federal, the state, and the local. And from my perspective, the local is indeed extraordinarily crucial. So we do thank you. I think there's more agreement than disagreement, and I think together we can achieve our goals.
Well, we thank you, Mayor Tyson. We thank you, each of our panelists. The roll call on the floor has been sounded, and I think this may be, as a result, an appropriate point to take a brief recess so that the members can record their votes on the floor, and then we will reconvene and hear from the second panel. The committee stands in recess.
Hurry back so we can get out of here.
The subcommittee will come to order at the direction of the subcommittee chairman, who is attending the roll call vote on the floor of the House. We're going to begin the testimony of our second panel of witnesses. Without objection, the prepared written statement of each of the witnesses will be made a part of the record, and we would welcome the oral statement of each of the witnesses, reminding the witnesses that the subcommittee operates under a 5-minute rule for oral statement summaries. We welcome this morning Mr. Ivan Seidenberg, who is president of the United States Telephone Association, Mr. Decker Anstrom, who is executive vice president of the National Cable Television Association, Mr. Jan Sawinski, chairman of the Fiber Optics Division of the Telecommunications Industry Association, Ms. Lorinda Ackerley, chairman of the Government Affairs Committee of the United States Telephone Association, Mr. Gene Kimmelman, the legislative director of the Consumer Federation of America, Mr. Phil Verveer, who is of counsel for the Cable Television Association, and Ms. Mary Gardner Jones, secretary and director of the Older Women's League. The chair welcomes all of the witnesses this morning, and we will begin our testimony with Mr. Ivan Seidenberg, the president of the United States Telephone Association.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much. On behalf of the United States Telephone Association, we appreciate this opportunity to address you and the committee this morning on these very important matters. As part of our opening statement, we have two major points that we'd like to offer to you and the committee. The framework I will use is the solutions that this particular piece of legislation offers presents both long-term opportunities and short-term opportunities to our industry. On the long-term side, the legislation seeks to create a standard for putting in a broadband fiber network by the year 2015. With our gross national product of the country representing some 30% related to communications and information-intensive industries, it is very important that we set our sights on developing a broadband network to support the economy of America. To do that, we must have changes in public policy. As it was pointed out in the first panel, telcos currently are barred from offering cable-type services, whereas the cable industry is currently not barred from offering similar services in telecommunications. The simple matter in the long term is that without relief in this legislation, we cannot achieve a broadband network by the year 2015. Current regulations focus our attention on providing narrowband services. For the past 50 years or so, the Communications Act has focused on the proliferation of universal service, and substantially that task has been completed and is done. Some 93% of American homes have universal service. This particular bill offers us a new standard that suggests in the long term we want universal broadband service. And without the sufficient changes in public policy, we cannot get there. I would also suggest that in this particular legislation, the framework for achieving this long-term objective focuses around local exchange carriers offering these broadband services as common carriers. And just to remind the committee of that, that suggests that we are ubiquitous in our delivery of services to everyone, that we have some rate and earnings oversight on the part of regulatory authorities at both the state and federal levels, and that particularly at the state level there is very significant oversight in the area of safeguards and service standards. As a final comment on the long-term perspective here, I would offer that with sufficient changes in the law here, we have an opportunity not to just meet the date of 2015 for a broadband network, but perhaps with the right incentives, we can sufficiently put in place a network that would beat that date. And with this, the view that the rest of the world is moving a lot quicker in this area than we are at this point, I would suggest that 2015 may not be good enough to get there. On the short-term side, what's very important about this piece of legislation is it provides very specific signals to the various groups today to launch all of the actions in energy that I hope that this bill is intended to stimulate. Quickly, it provides clear signals to consumers that there will be choice and strong alternatives. It provides clear signals to vendors and manufacturers that there will be secondary and tertiary markets through local exchange carriers to reach the marketplace and to provide their products and services. And it provides signals to regulators to focus their attention on removing the asymmetry in regulation that impacts us today in the marketplace. Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, I applaud, our industry applauds the effort that you and the subcommittee have taken in this area, and we look for the continued leadership of you and the committee in resolving this important issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Seidenberg, very much. Our next witness, Mr. Decker Anstrom, is the Executive Vice President representing the National Cable Television Association. Welcome, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for...
Could you please turn on your microphone? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing the cable television industry to share its views today on H.R. 2546. I'm Decker Anstrom of the National Cable Television Industry, and today we'd like to make 3 points on the issue of telco TV. First, the existing restriction on cable telco cross-ownership was valid when Congress adopted it in 1984, and it is still valid today. Second, an erroneous assumption underlines H.R. 2546, that the United States needs a pro-telco industrial policy in order to compete internationally. That is not true. And third, whatever wrappings may adorn this year's packaging of telco TV, the contents remain the same. It will allow the telcos to enter and to ultimately dominate television. Mr. Chairman, over the past decade, this committee has pursued a communications policy that emphasizes diverse information services and providers. That policy is working. The current cable telco cross-ownership restriction was codified in 1984 to help promote this diversity. Congress recognized that the local telephone companies have tremendous economic incentives to use their market power and their control of essential facilities to thwart competition at ratepayer expense. Today, the same competitive hazards and the same obstacles to effective safeguards remain, as my colleague Phil Verveer will discuss in more detail. While the cross-ownership restriction has helped to curb anti-competitive behavior, however, it has also produced an added benefit, a highly diverse and competitive communications marketplace. Cable's growth over the past decade is well documented, but many other video options have emerged as well. The number of over-the-air TV broadcasters has tripled. A fourth broadcast network has emerged. The VCR has found its way into 70% of all homes. Over 3 million consumers own home satellite dishes. A casual reading of just last week's press reveals that much more is around the corner. For example, Digital Equipment Corporation reported that the technology is in place now through our existing networks for multimedia telecommunications in which computing and television will be married. TV Answer is seeking licensees for its new wireless service that will transmit interactive data, information, and television over the air. And next month, the Advanced Telecommunications Test Center in Alexandria begins testing 6 prototype HDTV systems. These examples illustrate that the principle of diversity and the policies that sustain it are working. Which leads me to my second point. That is, America does not need a pro-telco industrial policy to be internationally competitive. Nothing in current law prevents the telcos from building advanced communications networks, including fiber to the home. And virtually every information service conceivable, except video, can be provided today over the telephone company's existing infrastructure. And yet H.R. 2546 would establish a national mandate for a nationwide broadband network and explicitly chooses the telephone company to control and construct that network. It envisions no role for broadcasters, cable operators, cellular companies, newspaper or magazine publishers, or satellite providers. This bill assumes we must pick winners, the telcos, to ensure that the U.S. can meet foreign competition. That assumption is wrong. Our international competitors are behind us, not in front of us. We invest 30 to 80% more per phone line than other industrialized nations. Japan does not contemplate starting its fiber project until the year 2000. In the U.S., telcos have dozens of experiments underway. And ironically enough, Japan and France, our most often cited competitive threats, have the same content restrictions on their telephone companies as we do. Finally, make no mistake about the true nature of this bill. While it wears the sheep's clothing of infrastructure modernization, upon careful inspection, we can detect the wolf's teeth of telco TV. H.R. 2546 would reverse the commitment to diversity that this committee has pursued. It would allow the telcos to become, in effect, giant TV stations. It would require American consumers to finance the telcos' $400 billion bet on becoming the TV tycoons of the 21st century. For these reasons, Mr. Chairman, we urge this committee to maintain our nation's current policy, which is working. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anstrom. Our next witness, Ms. Lorinda Ackley, is the chairman of the Government Affairs Committee of the United States Telephone Association and also the president of Taconic Telephone Corporation from Taconic Place, Chatham, New York. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I am also a member in good standing of the National Cable Television Association, as well as operating two small independent telephone companies. Through a subsidiary, Taconic operates a cable TV company, which it may surprise you to know it is denied membership in the New York State Cable Association on the basis that our participation would be harmful to the organization. I am here to provide the committee with a perspective of H.R. 2546 based on my experiences as a telco executive, cable executive, and representative of the Telephone Trade Association. Taconic operates in upstate New York and Richmond Telephone in Western Mass. Both are small but diverse telecommunication companies. In an effort to improve the quality of life for our customers, Taconic provides cable television service to 3,100 customers in 6 different communities within our telephone service area. If I leave but one message with the subcommittee, it is that my cable company and the other 200 telco cable entities providing cable to over 500 communities nationwide are demonstrating the consumer benefits of telco cable today. The 6 communities Taconic serves range in size from 400 to 2,300 residents, and we were just recently awarded a 7th franchise. I believe our track record of being awarded a franchise in 4 out of 5 competitive bids in which Taconic has been involved is the best evidence that I could provide to the subcommittee to demonstrate the effort Taconic has and its employees to put forward on behalf of the local subscribers. But as rewarding as it was to win those 4 franchises in competitive bids, I would point out to the subcommittee that on 3 occasions, Taconic was the only entity seeking to provide service. Were it not for Taconic, I wonder if these communities would have any cable service. I believe Taconic's experience during the past decade speaks louder than any other testimony this subcommittee will receive today or tomorrow. Telcos provide cable for the benefit of the consumer today. We are doing so today. but we are hamstrung in this effort as only a small portion of the industry is able to compete. Increasing the rural exemption, while appreciated, is not enough for all companies. Rural telcos lack the market power to demand broadband advances in technology. To provide services to rural areas requires not just commitment to service, it requires money. Contrary to popular belief, living in the country does not automatically make everything less expensive. In fact, it can make some things quite costly. A sparsely populated area diminishes the buying power of a region because there are fewer people to share the underlying costs. Let me assure you, Mr. Chairman, we are not making money hand over fist. We entered the cable TV business to fill a void in the quality of life of this area. We entered the field because we wanted to ensure that our customers, our employees, and our families would have the same access to information services, educational opportunities, and health care as the rest of the Americans. But the rural exemption alone will no longer provide this assurance. Rural telcos do not possess the buying power necessary to demand of manufacturers the development needed to make a switch video and voice demand network economically feasible. While H.R. 2546 will assist by increasing the exemption to $10,000, it will most clearly benefit this nation's consumer by freeing the whole telephone industry to compete. H.R. 2546 does not merely provide for telco cable relief, it also mandates new safeguards. I believe the experience of rural telcos demonstrates sufficient safeguards exist at the state and federal levels to protect the interests of the ratepayers. Still, telcos are willing to discuss additional structural and regulatory safeguards where appropriate. Taconic, for example, has successfully complied with federal and state safeguards to protect the telephone ratepayer from cross-subsidization for almost 10 years. If anything, our cable ratepayers may be subsidizing the telephone ratepayers because the rules governing us as telcos are very strict. Taconic has successfully been providing cable TV without a cross-ownership incident or any allegations of impropriety, as have those telco cable entities serving 500 rural communities. Still, USTA and Taconic believes that the requirement of a joint board convening to determine what other regulatory safeguards might be needed, as provided in H.R. 2546, is acceptable. A separate subsidiary is not required by current law for rural telco cable companies. H.R. 2546 would require one for non-rural telcos. Our cable company uses a separate network and is operated as a separate part of our business. Not only does it have its own accounting books, it also has everything down to its own paper clips.
Thank you. Ms. Ackley, your time for opening statement has expired.
Okay.
I hate to
I would like to thank you for the
but I thank you very much. And may I also note that another roll call has gone off on the floor. And perhaps what I could ask is the gentleman from Virginia, if he would be kind enough to do so, to chair so that I could go over and vote, and then on a relay system perhaps then come back and take the chair once again. So if I could, before I do that, let me recognize Mr. Phil Verveer, who is representing the National Cable Television Association here today. He's a partner with the law firm of Wilkie, Farr, and Gallagher. We welcome you, sir, and whenever you feel comfortable, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My testimony will address the theory and practice of regulatory safeguards of the sort proposed by H.R. 2546. There is very little basis for optimism that regulation will protect either consumers or the competitive process if telephone companies are permitted to enter the television business. Theory tells us this, and so does history. To begin with the theory, telephone companies are different. The difference is not a function of their size, their traditions, or the moral acuity of their officers and employees. It is a function of the type of regulation to which they are subject. Telephone companies are subject to cost of service regulation. That form of regulation has been practiced in the United States for about a century, and its advantages and disadvantages are very well understood.
One of its disadvantages is the source of most of the competitive controversies that have beset the telephone industry for its entire history. Cost of service regulation prevents local telephone companies from fully exploiting the economic value of their monopolies by limiting their profits by reference to underlying costs. The very purpose of public utility regulation is to prevent telephone companies from earning monopoly profits in local distribution markets where they have power. As a result, they have an economic incentive to evade these constraints to fully recognize the value of their monopolies. Diversification into adjacent markets enables telcos to garner and keep profits otherwise foreclosed to them. The means for doing this are cross-subsidies and discrimination. The victims are telephone ratepayers as well as competitors in and consumers of products and services in the unregulated markets. Cross-subsidies has a very special meaning with respect to the public policy issues we're talking about today. They involve a local telephone company shifting unregulated costs to the regulated side and shifting regulated revenues to the unregulated side. The greater the cost borne by telephone ratepayers, the higher the profitability of the regulated business, and the greater the opportunity to operate in competitive markets with seemingly lower costs. This displaces competitors, even more efficient ones, all at a net loss for consumers. This is the answer to Mr. Bryant's question about the availability of programming to independent broadcasters. We cannot be sure that telephone company investment decisions in integrated markets are in fact efficiency-seeking. The other major anti-competitive practice is discrimination. For most businesses, discrimination is expensive. It typically involves refusals to deal in one form or another and thus requires the perpetrator to forego revenue. But for telcos, cost of service regulation makes discrimination a less expensive and thus more likely strategy. Cost of service regulation permits telephone companies to force the general ratepayer to pay for the sales that would have been made but have been foregone as a result of discrimination. Regulatory safeguards attempt to prevent these kinds of telephone company misconduct by fiat, but they do not and cannot alter the telephone company's incentives to engage in this kind of misconduct. Regulation tries to command telcos to act against their own best interests. It is predictably ineffective in this effort. History confirms what theory predicts. Regulatory safeguards have failed to prevent anti-competitive activity on a continuing basis. Recent examples described in Mr. Anstrom's formal testimony include the NYNEX Material Enterprises controversy, an example of cross-subsidization that has been the subject of state and federal regulatory actions, and the U.S. West GSA controversy, an example of discrimination which led in part to the payment of a $10 million civil fine for violations of the MFJ. What is striking about these examples is their lack of subtlety. Notwithstanding regulatory and legal rules plainly prohibiting such conduct, it occurred, harming both ratepayers and competitors. It took years for the government to detect and to sanction the conduct. More often, however, problems of cross-subsidy and discrimination have occurred in more ambiguous contexts. In a world of changing technology and inherently arbitrary accounting rules, there almost always are plausible excuses for price and quality differentials and unequal access. H.R. 2546 relies largely upon the traditional safeguard mechanisms already available to the FCC. Indeed, in several instances, the current remedies are diminished by H.R. 2546 rather than enhanced. The FCC and later the Congress came to the view that telephone companies should be excluded from the television business only after less restrictive regulatory safeguards were attempted. That experience, which involved only non-Bell telephone companies and a much smaller number of cable companies than in operation today, showed decisively that regulation was ineffective. There is no reason for optimism that the outcome would be different should H.R. 2546 be enacted. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes now Mr. Jan Sawinski, the chairman of the Fiber Optics Division of the Telecommunications Industry Association. Mr. Sawinski.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to support H.R. 2546. This is a bill that's about the national interests and not about special interests. Today I'm representing both Corning, the inventor of optical fiber, and the Telecommunications Industry Association. Mr. Chairman, we believe that you should pass H.R. 2546 because it will accelerate the deployment of an interactive broadband network a communication network that's essential to our nation's long-term prosperity. Our desire is to see regulatory barriers removed so that this technology can be deployed. And frankly, we're not concerned about who deploys it. This interactive broadband network will have three fundamental characteristics. It will move massive amounts of information in the form of pictures, data, words, numbers, and sounds, and do it all simultaneously. It will move this information rapidly, and the important point is in two directions. And it will move this information from any one user to any other user, connecting any point in the network to any other point, so that all users can communicate interactively. The only local networks in America today that have these characteristics are private networks owned by large corporations. Our homes, our schools, our hospitals, small businesses, and government offices do not have access to these kind of networks. To make my point, today in this hearing room I wanted to do an interactive video conference demonstration for you. But I could not do this because the network serving this building doesn't have the necessary capacity. I had all of the equipment that was necessary to do this demonstration, but there was no way to interconnect the pieces of equipment together. So why does America need an interactive broadband network? And the answer is very simple. We're in an economic race, and in this race, speed wins. Those who can move and manage information the fastest will be the most productive and will enjoy the biggest slice of the economic pie. This means more jobs, a higher standard of living, and a better quality of life for your constituents. The network will make us more competitive by building on our thirst for information and our increased ability to process it with personal computers to improve our productivity growth. Let me give you some examples. Today, more than half of U.S. employment is devoted to information work, and that number is growing every year. And the processing capacity of computers has already skyrocketed by almost 6,000% and is expected to climb by another 10,000% by the year 2000. So why do we need this infrastructure now? Why can't we wait perhaps until the year 2050? Again, the answer is simple. Infrastructure takes time to deploy. It's not like turning on the lights. Development of new services to enhance our productivity takes time and must be preceded by a network to deliver these services. And finally, even if magically we could create a broadband network and the new services overnight, it takes time for people to learn how to use these tools to be more productive. Now, if we were the only horse in the economic race, we could continue to debate this issue for a long time, but the reality is that this race has already started and we need to move quickly. As has been said, Japan, our toughest economic competitor, has already launched a 25-year program to deploy fiber optics to every home, every school, and every business by the year 2015. The Japanese expect that 1/3 of their GNP in 2020 will be generated by this broadband network. If you're interested in the details of what Japan is doing, I submit for the record this recent issue of Telephony magazine, which has a feature article called Japan Thinks Big on the Fiber Front, and this has all of the details.
Without objection, that will be made part of the record.
Thank you. The key point is that the race is on and Japan is developing and we're debating. Japan has a plan and we don't. Now, there are many reasons to support this bill, but most importantly, you should support this bill because it's a reasonable compromise. It only lets 20% of the telephone companies, and that's the independent telephone companies, provide video programming. And it begins to open the door for broader competition by cable TV companies. You may be surprised, but personally I'm not troubled by this compromise. Let's start small and at least get the process going. Currently, the technology is stalled. With 20% of the market, we can test the regulatory safeguards, the market for new services, and the role of competition. And armed with this real experience, we can make better informed decisions later on. Mr. Chairman, over the next 2 years, Corning intends to spend roughly $200 million in capacity expansion and development of components necessary to help make this interactive broadband network a reality. We need your help if the benefits of this technology are to be realized by all Americans. We all want to make America more competitive. Let's work together to find the best way to do it. And on behalf of Corning and the TIA, I pledge to work with you to find a solution. Let's face it, future generations are counting on us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sawinski. The chair will now hear the consumer's point of view from two witnesses. And first, we're pleased to welcome to the subcommittee Mrs. Mary Gardner-Jones, the Secretary and Director of the Older Women's League. Ms. Jones, we'll be glad to hear from you.
Thank you, Mr. Boucher. I want to thank the committee for permitting OWL to testify. OWL is a grassroots organization. Our constituents are midlife and older women. We have a very direct and very real interest in this bill, and we're very pleased to support it. To us, the public network is our lifeline to the new telecommunications services. It's the only network we have to access it. If this network is not modernized, we won't share in the services and benefits that this network will be able to provide us. I know there's concern that consumers will have no use for a modernized network, and there are also fears that our rates will go up and that we will be paying for services that we'll never use. My fear is just the reverse, that unless the modernized network is modernized, we'll be stuck with an obsolete voice network and steadily rising costs as more and more users move off that network to other media, and that will be our only access. So for us, the modernization of the network is exceedingly important. The kinds of benefits that we'll get are also of real life meaning to us. And let me address myself to the date for a minute. Unless this network is modernized as quickly as possible, and the current date is to us a reasonable one, there'd be 2 generations of seniors who will never benefit from these services. There'd be 2 generations of kids who will never have the kind of educational opportunities that this network will provide. And there'll be 2 generations of middle-aged, middle-income consumers who will not enjoy the kind of quality of life and the kind of conveniences and benefits that this network will provide them. The kind of services that our members are concerned with are the health care services. Preventative health care is enormously important. The kind of interactive consulting, advice, health care databases that will now be available to us over this network are really of essential importance to us. Increasingly, older women and midlife women as well, when they're working, and older women who may have chronic problems, have problems meeting doctor's appointments, getting to the doctor, transportation problems, time problems of getting there. If we can have the kind of advice and consultation services that these networks can now provide us, then we'll be able to, in fact, have the kind of health care we need. Monitoring of home care workers in the home, monitoring of our elderly when some of our midlife women are working is enormously important to us. This we can't do without a modernized network. Telecommuting possibilities in the home are of enormous importance to midlife women. Many midlife women are caregivers of their children and caregivers of their elderly parents. Many of them are choosing or trying to work at home. With this kind of network, this will be far easier for them to do. There will be all kinds of transactional services that will be available to us. Ability to now apply for licenses instead of having to go down to our municipal offices. All of these will make our quality of life far, far improved and, in fact, give us essential services. Some people say these are pie-in-the-sky services. They're not, Mr. Chairman. There is a Harvard community health plan, which is one of the biggest HMOs in the country, which is now installing these kinds of services to their members. They're installing a medical database, a medical advice and consultation service, electronic mail. This will not only make health care more efficient cost-wise, but it will give their members a kind of service they haven't got today. That's not kind of pie-in-the-sky services, or this HMO wouldn't be doing it. But it's far more expensive to do that now because they have to lay private wires instead of being able to use the public network. They have to make sure that there are some kind of terminals to reach their members, which also is a problem. They're giving Minitel terminals away at this point. When we can do it through either an enhanced television set or an enhanced telephone, this will be far simpler. There's a First Cities project, coalition, which is 15 Fortune 500 companies that are investing $1.5 billion in trying to research and bring on, in a test bed format, some applications for healthcare and education services to the home. They've now got a test bed that is 200,000 citizens in 10 cities. I will hold my rest of my remarks and hope that I can give them to you in the form of answers to your questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Jones, very much. I'd just like to note at this point, because the House may adjourn this evening for the 4th of July recess, that we will have our hearing tomorrow morning on cable as it relates to the broadcasting industry, so that we can finish this trilogy with this cable and telephone company hearing, following upon the heels of last week's cable and satellite industry hearing, which will give our committee the full profile of the pressures that we have to balance as we construct a telecommunications formula for the future. But that hearing will be held tomorrow morning at 9:30, and they're trying to telescope tomorrow's business into today as well out on the House floor, which presents another conflict for me, because if we do stay in late tonight, I'm going to need some help because it is my wedding anniversary, and I'm going to need some people to help me with some words that I might have to begin expressing around 4 or 5 this afternoon. The next witness, Mr. Gene Kimmelman, is here as the Legislative Director of the Consumer Federation of America. Welcome back, Gene.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of the Consumer Federation, I appreciate this opportunity to express our views on H.R. 2546. I'd like to say at the outset, I'd like to commend you for once again turning the attention of this subcommittee to important long-term communications policy goals, as well as the short-term concerns that consumers have about where we're headed with our policy. H.R. 2546, we believe, would make an important contribution towards setting long-term communications policy goals, particularly the bill's focus on the need for interoperability in our communications networks, equitable distribution of services and technology in our systems, the efficient joint use of communications equipment, promotion of competition through the local cable franchising process, and most importantly, promoting educational and healthcare-oriented services through the use of communications equipment are very important policy goals that we share with the authors of this legislation and are a tremendous contribution to the policy debate about our infrastructure. We do also have a number of significant problems with aspects of the legislation, with some of its details. For example, we are opposed to the telephone company entry into the content business, and we are concerned that excessive ratepayer-financed investment in network upgrade could drive up local phone rates. However, what I would like to focus on with you this morning is what I think is the key to this important policy contribution of this legislation, and that is, I think, to make this legislation work, its goals, which are very laudable, need to be slightly refocused. And I think this is what Mr. Tozan was getting at before with his comments. From our perspective, we believe the goals need to be slightly turned in the following way. Rather than focusing on who provides services and industry rules, the legislation's goals ought to be focused on who receives services, what users get, and how their needs are met. More specifically, we think the goals ought to be in this legislation to provide the most cost-effective method of meeting the needs of providing all services from all aspects of the communications industry, including the aspects described by Mr. Anstrom before. And the second goal of this legislation ought to be to provide the most efficient structural rules to meet users' needs with the most limited government intervention with the maximum competition possible. Now, with this slight refocusing of the legislation's goals, we believe that the bill's notion of developing a coherent infrastructure plan is an excellent idea for long-term policy development in the communications field. Of course, we also have some short-term concerns that we have reflected with the subcommittee before, and I'd like to highlight them along with these long-term ideas. We need your help to take care of the immediate problems that consumers have with the cable industry: soaring cable rates, poor service, and monopolistic industry practices. We think these problems are best addressed, Mr. Chairman, with your legislation, H.R. 1303, to provide consumers immediate protection from these monopolistic practices and to bring down cable rates. So we hope the subcommittee will move quickly to deal with both the immediate needs of consumers and to put in place a long-term policy plan. As I've discussed before with Mr. Boucher, we are prepared down the road to look at, when a telephone company becomes video capable, whatever policy approaches, whatever incentives are necessary to make sure that once the capacity is available, that consumers get video services over that capacity. So we urge you and your subcommittee to combine the short-term goals of your legislation with the appropriate long-term focus of Mr. Boucher and Mr. Oxley's bills to make sure that we are meeting consumers' communications needs in this country. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, and I thank each of you for your excellent opening statements. Now we'll turn to questions from the subcommittee, and the chair will recognize himself. And I'd like to ask Mr. Seidenberg and Mr. Sawinski and Mr. Verveer, if they could, to comment upon my first question, which is that H.R. 2546 is an effort to give telephone companies the economic incentive to rapidly modernize the telecommunications infrastructure by allowing them to compete in the cable television market. This would be accomplished through a phased lifting of the restrictions which prevent the telephone companies from offering cable TV services in their phone service areas. So underlying this issue is a fundamental question of economics. Estimates of the cost of the broadband fiber optic telecommunications infrastructure are as high as $250 billion. Now that seems like a lot of money until you realize that's how much our country will have to pay to bail out the savings and loans crisis of the 1980s, and perhaps therein lies the problem with our country more than anything else, so that we don't properly use the limited resources which we do have. Most of it is now going to be used, that is the discretionary income, just to pay for an unnecessary debt run-up in the 1980s. And what I hear from telephone companies saying is, you can't expect us to build a network unless you allow us to fully benefit from it. So if given the regulatory freedoms contained in H.R. 2546, what do you estimate then, Mr. Seidenberg, Mr. Sawinski, to be the cost of modernizing the telecommunications infrastructure with broadband fiber by the year 2015? Please.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, one way I would answer that question is that let me dismiss up front the fact that there is one bill will fix all fiber broadband to the home at one time. I think if I may, if you look at this as a way to run and provide service in the telephone service area, generally it costs about, on a first cost basis that we would use the term, which is to install a copper loop. You're talking about, on the low end, maybe $1,000 to a high end, maybe $1,200 to put under current dollars. If you look at the cost of putting in broadband to the home, which would include some combination of fiber in the feeder, fiber in the distribution plant, and some other vehicle to get directly into the home, you're looking at a cost of something of the order of 75% higher than that. So the problem that we have is that as we look out into the future, if we really want to go from universal narrowband service to universal broadband service, we've got to close that gap. Now, Mr. Sawinski can help close the gap by further reductions in technology and efficiencies in providing broadband and electronics, and maybe perhaps there's 10, 20, 30% gap there. We still have another gap to close, which is we need to get greater utilization of the assets we would put in place. and legislation such as this helps that. So the key is to really get full utilization out of the broadband that we would put in, and it is a question of economics and it is a question of vision. And when you add those two together, I think we need a public policy change to make this happen.
Does anyone disagree? Before we go to Mr. Sawinski, anyone disagree with Mr. Seidenberg's analysis of the economics and the vision which is necessary to accomplish this goal? Mr. Anstrom?
Mr. Chairman, I just point out that the estimates, I think as your question suggested, are indeed quite far-ranging. Ray Smith, the chairman for Bell Atlantic, for example, has put the cost at twice what Mr. Seidenberg just indicated. He said $400 billion to build this kind of broadband network. The fact is no one knows, and I think it would be very dangerous to make a policy decision based on costs that are very unpredictable.
Well, let me ask then, if I could, what percentage then, Mr. Seidenberg, of the revenues which would be necessary would be derived from video service revenues, which you would be able to garner from the opportunities given to you by the legislation that is before the panel this morning?
I don't know the answer to that. I would suspect initially it would be very small, and it would be something that we would have to get some trial and error and experience and allow the market to develop. Remember, the key here for us is that we don't necessarily today view ourselves as the pervasive or the dominant provider of any of the applications that would go over the network. That would be something that would have to come in collaboration with others.
I understand that. So what you're saying is that it would be minimal over the first 5 to 10 years? What is the time frame that we're talking about with regard to a significant contribution from revenues garnered by video services towards the goal of creating this fiber optic network for the country?
I think it would be minimal forever, frankly. I think what we would hope to do is to see the basic public switch network capability grow, and with the opportunity for us to also provide applications over that network that would help stimulate development. But I don't see at any foreseeable time that we would become significant in terms of the offering of the content and the programming side.
So would the bulk of the revenues for the construction of the network continue to come from the provision of telephone services?
No, it would be a combination. Remember, there are other kinds of services that one offers over a broadband other than just
Well,
video.
give us some sense then in terms of the, the economic pie here in the telecommunications sector that would be used to construct the new network in terms of the contribution that would come from the telephone side. Would it be closer to 75%, 50%, 25%? Where would you put it?
Well, I can dream out loud. I'm not sure I know how to answer the question, but if we look at the current business, just like plain old telephone service, what you find is usage-based services and all of the add-on services that go with providing basic telephone service. It's probably about 30 to 40% of the total bill of someone that ranges in these kinds of added services. Now, and I wouldn't apply that figure to this new environment we're talking about simply because the role of telecommunications is changing such that it's not the same world. When 30% of the gross national product is focused on communication and information-intensive industries, we're talking about a brand new model. And the key is to stimulate development of getting there. And I don't know if I'm answering your question, Mr. Chairman, but the key is that you need the economic incentive to make sure we stimulate development. And I don't see that any one activity here will tend to dominate the behavior of the customer in the marketplace.
What I'm trying to reach is the question of what it would cost a telephone subscriber, the average telephone subscriber, in order to make a contribution to this infrastructure development, which would merge voice, video information into a single service that could be provided interactively over a fiber network, and to project over a 15, 20, 25-year period what the telephone subscriber might expect in terms of an increase in their bills.
All right, can I try it one more way?
Sure, please.
And again, by example, we have customers on average that will pay $100 a month for cellular service. We have cable customers, and the facts are well documented of what customers would pay for those services. The average telephone bill is $18 to $20. So there's clearly a range of what people will pay for added value. And the key here is to provide the kind of services to both business and residents customers that will allow them to make the choices that they're looking for.
I guess my point would be that I would pay anything in order to have my telephone not disconnected. And without a Public Utility Commission control over what you could charge for that, there would be a very large pool of people who would continue to be connected regardless of the charge because of the necessity of having it as a service. So I'm just trying to get some sense as a result, not of what the range is right now, since cellular phone is viewed more as a luxury rather than as a necessity, how we would deal with those who would still be using their phone as a necessity, and what they could expect to be their rate contribution in order to accomplish the vision of the fiber optic network.
Well, I'm not doing a good job at answering this question.
I understand.
I don't think that there's any guaranteed need to increase rates significantly to cover this, as has been suggested. You don't have to pay anything to not have your phone disconnected. There are rules and regulations as common carriers that we follow all the time. So I don't think there's any concern there. Like any good business running and dealing with regulators, that as we would seek to put in additional capability in the network, we'd have to demonstrate to them the value that that brings and what the rates that would cover. And I think you have a very good set of protections in the federal and state regulatory authorities to make sure that whatever increases occur because customers want to pay for them.
Well, let me ask Mr. Anstrom then to respond. That's an attractive proposition which he presents. You are from an unregulated industry, the cable industry. There's no check on your rates. They can go as high as you decide that you want to place them in terms of your relationship with your consumers. The telephone company is not in that situation. Why isn't that an attractive alternative if we have a vision of a fiber optic network in the country to rely upon this historic relationship between the public utility commissioners and the telephone company to set some reasonable rates that would get us towards our goal and not look to the cable industry to accomplish that purpose?
Let me just briefly, if I might, Mr. Chairman, touch on the opening part of that question. The difference, I think you very succinctly summarized in your question to Mr. Seidenberg, which is that if we raise our rates too high, people will drop their cable service. If the telephone rates go too high, they will not, and that's the difference between an essential and an unessential service. I think you've gone right to the core of the risk that's involved in telco TV, however, in terms of your questioning here.
Can I ask,
yes.
Are there significant disconnects of cable across the country?
Not at this point, because I think that cable is generally regarded as a good value by our consumers. I would point out that in cases...
What I'm pointing out to you, Mr. Anstrom, is the telephone company would argue if you took off our controls and you let us go as high as we want, you wouldn't see significant disconnects of telephones either, because people would see a significant value. They wouldn't... so this is the difficulty that we get, Mr. Anstrom, where you can't have it both ways, and I understand that you're left in this difficult position here, but I will tell you, for one, the chair does not accept it as a
If I could, for the record, however, say that in instances where cable operators have raised their rates too high, people have disconnected or they've dropped premium services. That record's very clear. Now, if I could go, if I might, for a minute to the general issue that you raised, I think if you're looking at a $400 billion investment in a telco broadband infrastructure plant that's only going to generate minimal revenues from video services, which Mr. Seidenberg has just testified to, that is proof positive of what Rand and Harvard and others have said, that telephone ratepayers are going to have to pay the differential in that cost. That's the risk.
Right, gentleman's time, my own time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Oxley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask Mr. Anstrom in regard to the bill. First of all, there was some discussion at the previous panel that the legislation didn't specifically authorize cable entry into telephone, but let me just quote you some language from my bill along with Mr. Boucher, quote, the legislation encourages, quote, the modification of impediments to convergence of telephone and video technologies, which would be the encouragement of that kind of process to take place. Isn't it a fact that the cable industry is already looking into that? As a matter of fact, have made some significant steps towards that direction regarding PCNs, and isn't that a natural progression that the chairman mentioned in his opening remarks, that you have really a convergence over the next several years of companies that now are described as cable or telephone or whatever it may be, now more and more blurring those distinctions and becoming essentially telecommunications providers or communications providers. Isn't that really a natural progression? And if that is indeed the natural progression, what does the cable industry have to fear about that?
Let me respond, if I can, to several of the points you raised. First of all, with respect to your legislation, it is true that in the findings section of Title III, there is the language that you quote. However, I think as Mr. Gordon very succinctly stated on the first panel, there's nothing statutory in the language of the bill that would preempt state regulatory action in this area, which generally has kept cable companies out of not only telephony, but I might also add data and information services. And I would predict, Mr. Oxley, that if this bill passed, every telephone in the country, if we went to the state PUCs, would oppose our entry into telephony. That's the history. Now, with respect to your question about where the cable industry is going, it is true that we have a handful of experimental licenses that have been filed and approved at the FCC. Those experiments have not even started yet. As we modernize our plant, we want to see whether our technology will allow us to do some things. We don't know if the technology will work. We don't know if the telephone companies will preempt this business. Frankly, we don't even know if this is a business, nor does anyone else yet. So I think it would be very premature to reach any policy conclusions based on a handful of experiments that have not even started yet.
Well, I assume that the cable industry is devoting quite a bit of capital to finding that out, which under my definition is nascent capitalism, nascent competition, which has got to be very encouraging. I see Mr. Kimmelman shaking his head, and I think that's clearly what the goal of our bill is doing, and apparently it's already happening. Our argument is that this legislation would indeed exacerbate the rush towards fiber optics. I know the cable industry is doing a lot in fiber optics already and are quite proud of that, and they should be. What this bill does is seek to encourage that. Mr. Seidenberg, are you worried about the cable folks getting into PCNs and to potentially get into telephone service?
Well, I think they're already doing that. You know, we've read all about all of the examples and the alliances. We heard one this morning. Cox Cable just recently bought a percentage of Teleport, and we've seen Macaw and British Telecom merge. So I think worrying about it may be an understatement. I think it's already happening. And the thing I want to make sure that we in the industry don't do is fall asleep at the switch and not make sure that we come in and explain that without some changes in public policy, we can't continue to grow the vision of a universal broadband network. And this is just one of the steps along the way that need to happen. So to answer your question, Congressman, is that those trends that you mentioned are happening, that will happen. There are no bars against them. And so the real issue is what response we have rather than what restrictive policies that we're seeking. We're not seeking any restrictive policies.
Mr. Kimmelman, I'm sorry I wasn't here for your testimony, but I wonder if you could just tell me essentially what your position is, re-regulation vis-a-vis competition, and how that particular position would help the consumers of this country.
Well, I think we share your goal in getting to competition as soon as makes sense to do so. We believe there's a two-stage process here. Even if we were to agree with everything in your legislation, we think it would take a number of years under the best of circumstances before there really would be strong competitive forces to the cable industry. So we have supported the chairman's bill to re-regulate cable, and we would suggest that the way one could move a transition is to say that regulation disappears when competition exists. Now, on the specifics of your bill, there are a number of things that we share in your goals, and we think explicitly it's a very important idea for the Congress to set long-term policy in this area. and to set some goals. So we think you're making an important contribution here. Where we differ is on the notion of telephone companies' entry into the content business. We think there are significant dangers there that outweigh the benefits. And secondly, as the previous discussion was getting at, we have some concern as to how this modern network will be financed. We think there are a number of ways of going. The ambiguity here is the date. What will 2015 do in terms of current investment plans versus what they would be under this bill? And secondly, there are two options of going there. One is to finance it with ratepayers' money, of which we're vastly concerned about if it drives telephone rates up. The other is to finance it separately from investors and add on to the current network, not in terms of new wires, but moving to fiber optics, but getting the capital in the private market and putting the risk on the phone company investor separately. From our perspective, that would be a better option. I think either of them are available under your legislation. The legislation is open to a number of options.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Bausch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Seidenberg, let me begin with you and get one matter clearly stated for the record. The bill, as you know, does not affect the modified final judgment, which was the decree handed down in the AT&T divestiture that prohibits the Bell regional operating companies from being involved in information services. And since it doesn't do that, our legislation by itself, should it pass and become law, assuming no change in the modified final judgment by Judge Green, would still leave the Bell operating companies barred from offering cable television service. Now, given that fact, can we assume in this subcommittee that the Bell operating companies are also supportive of our legislation and are urging that it be passed?
Yes, sir.
That's exactly the answer I was looking for. Thank you. That's very clear and to the point. And let me just pursue that by saying, is it the intent of the Bell operating companies actively to pursue the passage of the bill? Will you be devoting time, resources, effort, whatnot?
Yes.
All right, thank you.
We need other legislation as well, as you pointed out.
Well, I'm well aware of that. Mr. Kimmelman, let me turn to you. There are a handful of communities in the United States where some measure of competition exists in the offering of cable television service. Tell us, based on your research, what the results are in those communities in terms of the cost of cable television service to the consumer measured on a cost per channel basis.
Well, our understanding is there are only about 40 or 50 communities that have overbills that actually have competition, and at least as an average matter, the results are overwhelmingly to the benefit of the consumer. The information we have indicates that on a per channel basis, the price of that cable service is about 50% less than in the average community that has only one cable system. So there is no doubt that not only the theory of competition, but the practice of competition in this area can provide some very, very concrete benefits to consumers.
It's about 50% less as the cost on a per channel basis than it is otherwise across the country.
Yes.
Let me ask you this. Does your organization see some contradiction, even perhaps hypocrisy, in the position of the cable industry, where that industry is actively trying to compete with telephone companies? Some of the examples were cited earlier. Let me just review one or two of those. Cox, a company that I understand has some 24 cable operations nationwide, has now acquired a 12.5% interest in the Teleport Communications Group. They operate private fiber optic networks that can compete directly with telephone companies. Comsat Corporation, a Philadelphia cable company, is buying cellular operations in that city. And the FCC has approved applications for experimental licenses for 3 of the major cable companies to develop and build personal communication networks, yet another way that cable companies can compete directly with telephone companies. We have that going on the one hand. On the other hand, we have a very interesting recent circumstance where the city of Niceville, Florida, took a poll of all of its residents and found that 83% of those residents wanted another company to come into competition with the existing cable provider. And based upon that information, the city undertook itself to build that second cable company, made a commitment to issue $2 million in revenue bonds in order to finance the construction, and was in the process of putting that plan into effect when it was sued in U.S. District Court by Warner Communications, having cable interests, apparently being the cable provider in that community. And Warner's argument was that if the city built its own cable system, not that that would impair the franchise in some respect, it was an unrestricted franchise, but that very fact that there was another cable company in the city, operated by the city, would be a violation of Warner's free speech rights. Doesn't exactly sound to me like an industry that welcomes competition on any front. The lower court dismissed the case. The case was appealed to the Supreme Court. The National Cable Television Association submitted a brief in support of that First Amendment argument that the second system should not be provided. Now, given all the problems that consumers face in terms of high prices, inadequate service, lack of opportunities for alternative programs, the lack of expansion of cable service into rural areas, given all of those problems, do you see some hypocrisy in that position? Does it concern you as the representative of one of the largest consumer organizations in the country?
Well, Mr. Boucher, I think you have a lot of the facts right there. Let me start off by trying to say something nice about the cable industry. I think that Mr. Anstrom was correct that there are certain impediments to cable companies getting into other businesses that are certainly worth looking at. And let me also agree with him that we see certain problems related to telephone companies, as he points out, both in his written and oral statements. However, I think your point is absolutely accurate, that while on the one hand it's quite obvious the cable industry has opposed re-regulation, we understand they do not want the government to bring cable rates down through regulation. It is claimed to be pro-competitive, and yet we cannot find an appropriate manner in which that position has been enunciated, is found in the marketplace. We have examples of satellite distributors claiming discrimination, inability to get programming. We have claims of other technologies having difficulty getting in. Everywhere one looks, it appears that the cable industry is trying to thwart competition and not promote competition. And this most recent example you cite is just the most clear example, where it's even the people of a town who vote overwhelmingly for a second cable system in a system that was not exclusive at the franchising term. Now, we can understand how a cable company might feel that if the terms and conditions were different, that it would need to renegotiate its franchise or its contract. But to indicate that it's inappropriate for that system to be built out of their First Amendment concerns, we think is the most clear example of why the Congress needs to legislate.
Gentleman's time, unfortunately, has expired. Again, we're under a severe time restriction. We have to vacate this room by 1 o'clock. We may be able to run over slightly in order to accommodate the remaining three members, but that is the reason why it is necessary to closely adhere to that 5-minute rule. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Ritter.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Verveer, we see price cap regulation going into play with the telephone companies, and you made the statement that rate of return regulation would allow cross-subsidizations, but you also said that when they go to price caps, that cross-subsidy can remain. Isn't there a disincentive to do cross-subsidies once you're into price cap regulation? How do you explain your comment?
Mr. Ritter, if we were able to move to a pure price cap, a situation where the government set a ceiling on telephone company prices and then simply walked away from any concern about whether or not the profits that the telephone companies earned were reasonable, were excessive, and so forth, you would, in fact, get away from any concerns about cross-subsidy. That is not where we are right now. The FCC and all of the state regulators that have gone to price cap types of regulation that I'm aware of in fact, are going to engage in regular reviews of the level of profitability of the telephone companies subject to that. And that means that the incentives to shift costs to cross-subsidize remain.
You're saying that there's some problem then with the overall price cap model. You basically can cheat with the price cap model on cross-subsidy in a way that you wouldn't normally think you could, simply because of the logistics of review, between review periods. Is that what you're saying?
Mr. Ritter, the reality, I think, with price cap regulation, the way it's been adopted, is that underlying costs still have something to do with it. That under price caps, as we've adopted them, we do care about whether or not telephone companies are profitable, what the level of profitability may be. Now, there are some other detailed concerns as well that have to do with confiscating telephone company property, Fifth Amendment concerns if for some reason the ceilings turned out to be too low. But in the cross-subsidy area, the reality is that if you're going to do a regular profit review, or if you anticipate, as you might if you were a telephone company executive, that if you began to report very high levels of profitability, that the political process would come back and seek some review of why you were so profitable, that the incentives to shift costs to the regulated side of the business and to integrate into non-regulated activities on the basis of understated costs would remain a very strong incentive.
Switching gears for a minute, Jan Sawinski, we've heard numbers, the $400 billion number, the $200 billion number, $100 billion number. It seems to me that these large numbers, in and of themselves, are not the issue. They're not the impediment. I mean, because of the arrival of that number depends on whether people are making profits, whether people are making investments, whether services are coming into play. It's not as if that number is out there and we are constrained by that number. It may or may not arrive at $400 billion. It may or may not arrive at $100 billion. But it doesn't keep the Cornings of this world from going forward with investments because they see an opening, a growth area. I should think that the size of this this arena, this stage that's being set here is an incentive for companies like yours or all other companies to be involved. And we shouldn't be afraid of the fact that the number is high. The number is high because massive, wondrous new investments and new technologies will be made.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Could we have Mr. Sawinski just comment?
Very briefly, please.
Well, I'm glad you asked the question because I never got a chance to reply to Mr. Markey's question. I think the number of $250 billion or $400 billion is misleading. And the fact is that the telephone industry is investing every year in their network. They're modernizing the network, and they spend just on equipment, if you leave out labor, about $10 billion a year. And the real question is, what's the increment that has to be spent to put in a broadband network as opposed to what they're putting in now? And we haven't had time to do exact calculations, but I maintain that the number is closer to $50 billion over this 25-year period. Now, coming back to a point you made earlier this morning, there are two ways that you pay for that. One is the learning curve, and that depends on getting going and getting accumulated volume. And the second component of it is the point Mr. Seidenberg made, and that is revenue from additional services that you put over the network once you have it. And we're talking here today about cable TV services is outside the scope of this bill, but there's a whole bunch of other services that Ms. Jones talked about that can generate additional revenue as a second step.
Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Fields.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kimmelman, to play off of something you said just a moment ago, I think that there is a lot that can be said about cable companies in a very positive vein, and I say that as a sponsor of the Oxley-Boucher legislation to allow telephone companies into the cable business. I think there are a number of good corporate citizens. I think the cable industry as a whole has brought a dimension to public entertainment that no one imagined 10 years ago. But that's not to say that there are not some problems. And in my particular situation in Harris County, We have a cable company that I think rates are exorbitant. There's no local programming. My brother, back in Humble, is president of the chamber. He's on the board of directors of the Chamber of Commerce. He's on the board of directors of our local hospital group. Very active in the community, and I have asked him what the local cable company does for the community. And the answer I get from my brother, zip. And so I have to believe that there is a need for competition. And where I disagree with you, I disagree as to the need to re-regulate at this particular moment. And I also disagree in that I think that just by having this hearing, we're seeing a much greater response to community needs. And I would have to think that if the sponsors of this legislation are successful, that we would see better service to local consumers. And I have to feel that there would be a downward pressure on rates. And if I understand the objection of you and Mrs. Jones, the primary objection is the cross subsidies. If adequate safeguards were put in place, could both of you be supportive of this legislation?
We're very supportive of this legislation. We feel that the bill does in fact take care of the cross-subsidy problem as much as life can take care of any kind of problem. We always have the risk of cross-subsidies. We've always had it. We've dealt with it modestly well. I don't think this bill is going to raise any greater problems.
And I'm not going to
my sense is, if I just finish my sentence,
Right.
that we have to take risks in this world, and I think the risks for the consumers are that we don't do it, that we won't get the services, and in order to get the kinds of services and access to this world that I think consumers need, I'm willing to take that risk.
And I'm not trying to rush you. I want to get Mr. Kimmelman's answer, and I hope it'll be short. And with the chairman's indulgence, I'll have one short question for you, Ms. Jones, afterwards.
It'll be real short, Mr. Fields. I disagree with that. I think this is a whole new realm of cross-subsidy that we've avoided in the past. I think you can do much of what you're trying to do in this bill and promote the competitive future infrastructure without letting telephone companies into content, certainly not in the short term. So I think that you can get the result you want with a much more modest step here. You'll have to learn to walk before you run, and you don't just start competition. And I think what we learned from the 1984 Cable Act was by deregulating too soon, you've actually set back competition because the cable industry was able to consolidate with nobody else out there. We've got to undo some of that before we can get to a full competitive environment.
Ms. Jones, just one quick question with the chairman's indulgence. I know we're running short of time. If there is an enhancement, an interactive broadband network created, something that Mr. Sawinski talked about in his testimony, what do you envision for groups like yours? What type of benefits do you think would flow?
I think the health care benefits are going to be number one benefit to consumers. I think right after that, for youngsters, I think the educational benefits, and I try to spell that out in some of my testimony. And third, I think telecommuting is essentially important for my constituents.
Now, when you say telecommuting, you mean people not having to leave their home to be able to conduct business?
It's a real serious problem for midlife and older women. They have to have jobs. They need the income. It's very difficult for them sometimes to get to their jobs, sometimes to give the care for their kids or their elderly parents. Many of them are trying to do these work-at-home. What do? They get work-at-home schemes that try to inveigle them into this. They can really have serious kinds of opportunities to work at home.
And that can't happen under the current system.
The network simply will not facilitate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And in view of the time and the pressure on us, I'm just going to raise a couple of questions, and rather than request answers now, I would ask every member of the panel. I think it's significant that every member of the panel respond in writing to the committee. As we know, and others have gone into this, a large part of the rationale for telco entry is based on encouraging installation of the broadband fiber optic network. I think we all agree, bringing fiber into the home, if you will, for a number of reasons, security reasons, all sorts of reasons. I'm concerned about, well, certainty. You open up the door and you allow the telcos to come in. and then they drag their feet, if you will, or they might drag their feet if they're well. They may decide not to go that route at all, or whatever the case may be. So I should think certainly Mr. Kimmelman and many of you would be concerned with that, and there certainly is nothing in the legislation to protect in that regard. And the second area is an area that our Chairman Markey explored before I came back into the room, and that's, of course, the cost of the installation to the average customer. Mr. Kimmelman, by gosh, you certainly would be concerned with that, and I'd like to think most of the people would. Now, you know, we can continue to talk in generalities in response to both of those questions, but certainly to the second one. But I don't know, I'd hate to be a member of the Public Service Commission on any state try to wrestle with that particular problem in terms of dividing of costs, particularly when the fiber includes both cable and communications. So I'm not going to ask for responses today, but I would like to have you all submit your responses to the committee. Certainty, and if you're not concerned about certainty, then forget about it. But if you are concerned about it, how would you suggest we be sure something like that is going to take place? Micromanaging on the part of Congress, to be sure, but that's basically what we're doing anyhow. And then again, the costs, breakdown of the costs and how it might affect the consumer. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman from Florida very much. Let me say in conclusion that the committee is going to fully explore all of these issues towards the goal of legislating. Now, this hearing has been very helpful and informative in helping to lay out what the conflicting points of view are in letting the telephone companies into full video participation in the telecommunications marketplace. I have reservations about that. There's no question about it. On the other hand, I fully support the vision, the goal of Mr. Oxley and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Bauscher, towards the construction of a fiber optic network as soon as possible for our country. There's a tension, however, that exists in terms of the need to give full video rights to the telephone companies, the pressures upon ratepayers to subsidize that entry, and the need, on the other hand, for us to have this fiber optic network to compete against the Germans, the Japanese, and others who are moving in that direction. And I think that we can construct a formula in this committee that will meet the objectives of the country while balancing the interests of each of the parties that have been presenting their case to us here today. And we I think, can move forward in a atmosphere of cooperation towards that goal. I apologize again. The hearing must conclude at this time. The Energy Subcommittee is going to be meeting in 20 minutes in this very same room, trying to construct as well a national electricity grid that will make interconnective and interoperable the electrical grid of the country, balancing the rights of the utility, the large electricity generator, with the new competitors in the marketplace while maintaining protection for ratepayers. Seems like the same problem. It is. In each area we have to have a policy for the 21st century. This hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Here is a programming reminder now that the subcommittee will hold a hearing on cable TV regulation Thursday morning beginning at 9:30 Eastern Time, 6:30 a.m. on the West Coast. C-SPAN, our companion network, will bring you live coverage of the hearing beginning Thursday morning at 9:30 Eastern Time.
Recently, C-SPAN's Viewer Information Department received these letters.
It is apparent that the Speaker of the House cannot control the out-of-order conversations which continue to disrupt the Congress on a daily basis. Simply